here with Wendell from Level1Tech. So you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Wendell. I do stuff. I'm a computer janitor. I'm sort of glorified. We're doing this cross-posting thing. It's really weird. People can check out your channel, but I'm also posting it on my channel. So it's like in places, but there's not a lot of overlap between our audiences right now, probably.
No, and your audience is much larger than mine. So there's, well, I mean, unless you're talking about art, but it's like I've had some reach, but not with podcasts or whatnot. So I thought I'd give it a stab.
Well, for everybody in our audience, this is Brian. You might remember pixel art Lisa Sue or pixel art me being chased by the boulder when Threadripper launched because Threadripper 3000 was an historic occasion. Very exciting. That comes to us courtesy of Brian.
Yeah, I also did the one for you because how I started contact with you because I'd listened to your Level1Tech for years, but I did like a couple of series of just images for YouTubers that I ended up using a lot of time. Like my day would be filled up by their content, so I'd always watch you guys and stuff on there. So I'm like, I'm gonna do an image for Level 1. I feel like they would appreciate it.
I pointed the camera at the poster. It's hanging up in my office.
Okay,
so I
okay.
moved the camera so you could kind of see it. It's sort of fun.
Nice.
Yes. Yeah, it's pretty glorious, really.
Yeah, that one was funny. I think Ryan's lying on the floor.
Yeah, I'm passed out. Yeah.
So yeah, I did another one for like John Linneman. I did one more for Alex McCullough. But it's like I'm like, how often do you get it from like an actual professional artist? You know what I mean? It's like it's a fun thing.
Well, I wish we had Krista here because like artists that are also like super technical, kind of unicorns, and so you're definitely a unicorn because we've had some very super technical conversations. And the main thing on the agenda today is to talk about, Stream Deck. And
you mean Steam Deck?
Steam Deck, yeah.
We're not
the Elgato thing, Steam Deck. I was so paranoid I was going to do that.
It's okay. I got your back.
But you can stream with the Steam Deck from your Steam library.
Well, we're going to get into that because that's part of the Proton layer, I believe. So this is...
is this the streaming part or I thought the Proton layer was for running natively.
Oh, it is, but you said that you could also use Proton for streaming. I remember you telling me that.
Yeah, so you can kind of cheat a little bit, and it turns out that the graphics abstraction layers, you can do some fun things. We know that from working on like the Looking Glass side of things, but that's a conversation for another day.
Okay.
Or it's a conversation for a little bit. We're getting ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, and for anyone who doesn't know Wendell, I think it's funny because over the last like 3 years, I've noticed you also kind of became tech support for YouTubers on their obscure projects. Like you popped onto Gamers Nexus and Linus just when they're doing some weird server thing or something in Linux that's out of their normal range, and then you always show up on their channel writing.
It's fine. I mean, I don't know. I'm a computer janitor. Like YouTube is kind of a hobby for me. Like I still do mostly not YouTube things in order to be able to eat.
Yeah.
But the YouTube thing has been really successful, and I've been able to turn any benefit that I've gotten from that back into doing more of the same kind of stuff. And we've got 2 editors now, and so we're using Level 1, like the revenue that Level 1 generates, we're using on Level 1, which is great because we also don't have to live on it. So that's pretty nice.
Yeah.
It sort of changes the dynamic of things, but it's also like a lot of fun. And it's also a lot of fun to do projects because sometimes I get to work on projects and it's like, I'm doing this thing for you for money, but I think you should do this other thing that makes more sense. And then I can put my YouTuber hat on and be like, look at this amazing thing that I'm doing. And everybody is like, this is amazing. And it's like, oh, I was right.
That kind of makes me think of something that I was an idea I had, and I was like, I'm going to poke Wendell about whether or not there's any way to actually do this idea. But maybe we can come to the end because it's something specific. You were the first person that I wanted to talk to when the Steam Deck was announced. And that was because you obviously, like Level1Techs, very split between kind of your common technical analysis. And I always loved your basic podcast because you always talk about what's going on in security and what's going on with robots and everything. So you get like a little bit of everything. But your channel is kind of like split massively between that and then Linux and then software developing in Linux. And your forums are huge for Linux, right?
Yeah, we get sucked into the Linux people are very opinionated, and I try to take sort of a pragmatic approach, and it's just like this is absolutely proprietary, and it's like, well, I'm okay with absolutely like but yeah, I get it. So, but Linux is a lot of fun.
Yeah, well, Linux is like I've never dabbled in Linux, but for me, it's like probably the same part that like gets into like literally taking apart a console or like soft modding it when it's way past anyone using it. Like just to run usually some foreign game that was never released, and I'm just dying to play something obscure on it. But it's like it's all these little programs that people have written, and so you need like 10 different people's programs to usually do it, and then that's like it's like a puzzle to get these things to work sometimes. And I always loved that aspect, and my friends would always come to me to do that kind of things when I was a lot younger. But it's like, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying it's like that whole thing. You kind of, if you're like super into exercise, there's this thing that's called a runner's high, and it's like you get addicted to the runner's high. It's kind of like that with Linux. It's like you get
The
you
Linux
go through
side.
this like horrible, torturous experience, and then you get it working, and then you understand, and it's like, oh, I understand. And then you don't want to change it. That's the crazy thing. Is like you look at it from the outside and it's like, oh, this is a horrible user experience and I don't want to do this and blah blah blah. And then you sort of come to understand why it is the way that it is. And you're like, well, since I already know how to deal with this, let's not put effort into making it less awful.
Yeah.
Uh, and it's just a very superficial layer. And then like you peel back the superficial layer and you look, and it's like the most beautiful, elegant machinery that you've ever seen because like the kernel and how it handles device drivers and working with hardware is not pretty. There's a lot of bugs. There's layers and layers of bugs. The leaky abstraction, super leaky, but the software is really well organized and it's really sort of done at a higher level. And it might just be that most of the programming that I'm exposed to is commercial and barely works and is made out of baling wire and duct tape. And sort of the nakedness of open source is that when you're doing something idiotic, somebody will show up and be like, "Yes, this is idiotic. You should change this."
Well,
And
it's like
maybe it
exposing
leads to
yourself
a
to
better
flaws,
result.
right?
Yeah. Uh, Although there have been a lot of security flaws. It's like, many eyes make the bugs shallow. But there have been a lot
Mm.
of bugs where many eyes did not, in fact, make the bugs shallow. And I think that's partly because a lot of the people that have the intelligence necessary to spot that as a bug are busy with other things and didn't really notice that. So the bugs have to be obvious. And
Well,
the bugs being obvious come from the code being clean.
yeah, yeah. Well, you need people to report it, and you also need to focus. Like I've worked with so many programmers, and half of the time it's not competency that I've seen when programmers have let bugs slip through or anything like that. Like a lot of programmers that I work with that are super competent. It's just been they've been forced to focus elsewhere, and
Yeah.
or like they're mid writing something and then someone comes up to them and says, hey, write this instead, right? And then because we need this now to solve this problem, and then they have to shift their line of thought. They have to shift. Like for me it's similar because art's kind of like I got to get into a mental zone a lot of times, and it's like it's kind of funny because my wife does like crochet amigurumis, and she'll ask me to do like a sketch for one of them, and I'll be like, it'll take me 5 minutes to do the sketch, and I'll be like, oh, I don't want to. She's like, it'll take you 5 minutes, and I'm like, but it takes me 2 hours to come out of that mental state. So it's like the sketch takes me 5 minutes, but then I'm doing like I either am taking in everything and I'm being hyper analytical and studying things, or I'm completely disengaged from it and I'm not paying attention to it at all. And I wonder if coding's a bit like that.
Yeah, no, there are aspects of coding that definitely is like that because you end up loading your brain down with just this, hugely elaborate model, and it takes a lot of energy to sort of maintain that. And then once you're in that zone, you're super hyper productive because you get it and you're doing stuff and it makes sense. And then once you're out of the zone, you come back to your code later and it's like, ooh, I really wish that I'd written down what I was thinking because I don't have all of the context loaded in my brain, and now it's going to be a little bit more complicated to come up with.
And
Yeah,
you figured it out peeing the next day, right? It just snaps into your brain, or when you're in the shower, it's
yeah,
some location. You're like, oh, I should have thought of that.
yeah. I don't know why the conversation made me think of this, but I've been thinking about um, like one of the beautiful things about open source is there's a lot of code in Linux and other open source projects, even that predate Linux, that is very beautiful, and it's probably going to be here 50 years from now. And it serves as sort of living documentation, even though it's not really exactly documentation, because sometimes you look at source code and what the source code is doing has a lot of implied knowledge behind it. And so,
Mm.
like, you have to really look at it and understand what it's doing to sort of get that inferred knowledge. It's like, why did they do that this way? It seems obvious we should do it this other way. And then you try to do it that way. And it's almost like there should have been a comment there that was like, when you look at this and figure this routine can be optimized, increment this counter with how much time you wasted failing to optimize this thing that you think that you can optimize.
It's like a
And
mind paradox.
yeah, and so I've sort of been tinkering in my mind is like, what other stuff is like that other than open source? And
Mm.
there's this particular Sunbeam toaster from like the 1950s that like self lowers, and it's entirely mechanical. And it if you described it, you would assume that it's Internet of Things awful, but it's actually this wonderful, beautiful mechanical toaster. Its Achilles heel is it doesn't do bagels super well, but it's sort of the pinnacle of toaster technology, and the patents have expired and that kind of thing. And I sort of want to like collect some of these things and build a website and put them on there and be like, we should, as a society, should iterate on these things and not have god awful throwaway toasters and refrigerators. And we should have like the pinnacle of clothes washer technology and like the pinnacle of toasters, which is the Sunbeam toaster, or the pinnacle of keyboards, which
Yeah.
is of course the IBM Model M.
Oh
And you
yes,
can
going to the class.
and sort of put all that up because the patents on all of that have expired, and you can build your own. There's a guy that's building Model F keyboards, which is the predecessor to the Model M. And so the wonderful thing about the internet is there's this cult following for all of this stuff. And
Mm.
your artwork and the stuff that goes into that, and then some of the stuff that we do at Level 1, this could be like a thing like 50 or 100 years from now. It's like we don't think about designing 17 new models of toaster, which now it seems like every consumer appliance is out there to like do something nefarious in the background. It's like, no, we'll just build the pinnacle of toaster, the pinnacle of KitchenAid mixers. There's a whole community around like getting a KitchenAid mixer from the 1950s, redoing the electronics or the electrics to make it safe. And then it's
This,
the pinnacle of kitchen mixing technology.
it's the same with what is it? Glass, like glass cookware. Trying to
Yes.
remember the name of it, but
Pyrex.
Pyrex, yeah, it's the
Yeah.
same. Like we have a friend who collects Pyrex. It's like it's crazy.
And so that was a very long-winded way to come back to the Steam Deck.
Well, I was actually going to segue back to the Steam Deck from that because I thought of a way to do it. So it's like one of the things that I always find interesting is like things always they always polarize to the point when you have like when you have devices or you have technology where you have one really good open solution and one really good closed solution, and then the issue happens when the closed solution gets envious of the open solution or vice versa. It's like you get that with Apple and Microsoft, you get it with Android and iOS, right? It's like you typically get it with all of these environments where some big open option is going to create lots of space for people to do things, but there's going to be a little bit more jankiness. There's going to be issues with it, right? And then there's going to be one really good closed garden that is developed, and like I wouldn't touch Apple usually with a 1,000-foot pole, but I know people that enjoy it. But then what happens because I can be tech support, like I built most of my friends' computers. I fixed computers around offices when I worked at them, and then as soon as something was wrong with their Mac, I'm like, oh, I Google it, and I'm like, I can't get in there. I need to buy like these 10 special tools. It's like your hard drive's fried. I could fix it, but I can't get in to do it. And that's the problem with the walled garden. Or they would have like a specific device that they would want to do for some photo shoot at some event, and then it just turns out the software doesn't run on Mac, and I'm like, there's nothing you can do.
It's funny because it's a very good observation because historically Microsoft and Apple, they were in opposite positions. Microsoft
Mm-hmm.
was the closed, cathedral of insanity, and then Apple was like, hey, we've open sourced the Darwin kernel. We're going to keep the graphical bits as our special sauce, but if you want to run a Darwin based operating system, we're going to open the kernel and it's going to be open source. The first sign of trouble from Apple in the closed ecosystem, I think, was probably cups,
Mm.
because Apple put a lot of work into the printing subsystem, for the open source cups printing subsystem, and they really didn't want to share that. And also Bash, the command interpreter. There was this kerfuffle around, because Bash moved to, I think, GPL 3 or something like that, and Apple didn't want to use like the new command interpreter because it was like, GPL 3, we don't want to deal with this. Mm-hmm. And it's like, really, Apple, you're on a path to become $1 trillion company. Do you really think cutting the knees out from under cups and Bash really is going to affect your trajectory on becoming $1 trillion company? And so now they're just, like as you kind of describe it, and weirdly, Microsoft is like, yes, let's embrace Linux on the Windows desktop.
They were forced to, because Microsoft was getting jealous of Apple being closed. You could see that with their store ecosystems, with things like that, especially around the release of the iPhone and whatnot. You could see Microsoft getting jealous. At least, like externally, it looked that way. And the interesting thing about that is that as they tried to change their open ecosystem to a closed one, everyone was getting upset with them. They're like, what's with all this Xbox garbage on my games and Windows? What's up with this? Why are you trying to force me to this store every time I do anything? This isn't what I love about Windows. And then we had a bunch of iterations of Windows that led us in the wrong direction until Microsoft was kind of like, we're making enough money off of Azure now. We can just open up everything else and be okay. And
it's funny. There's another data point how you're exactly right, and that was when Gabe Newell went to Microsoft around the Windows 8 launch and was like, okay, I see what they've got planned for Windows Store. This is an existential threat to Steam. We are going full tilt Linux. So that closed trajectory, and Gabe Newell seeing that, is what has brought us the Steam Deck today.
It is, and also the fact that there was no way Valve was going to be paying a licensing fee to Microsoft for a copy of Windows for every single device they shipped.
Yeah.
There was not a chance that was going to happen. That would have added like $50, $60 to the cost of the system, and it would have hurt their branding overall because it wouldn't be their own thing.
I think the cost probably would have been on the order of like $5 to $10 because Microsoft already went through this with the Atom devices when iPad was taking over. HP and a lot of other Lenovo went to Microsoft and like, you're killing us with the Windows Home license. And so there is actually another OEM license that's below Windows Home, but it's still Windows Home, but your device isn't allowed to be beyond a certain level of powerful. And that was around the time that netbooks, like the second wave of netbooks was kind of happening. And so the licensing cost for that iteration of Windows is only on the order of like $10. But yeah, still $10 per device.
And the lack of, I think it's more the branding mismatch, because then you're forcing someone into an ecosystem where your brand is secondary initially. It's like the second you boot that device, it's going to have Windows-based stuff all over it. So they had to not use Windows, right? And this causes a bunch of things. So I guess I should probably introduce myself now, just in case. But I'm Brian Heemskirk. I'm the lead artist at Massive Damage. I do art direction and stuff there as well. I've worked in the game.
Lower third in, it'll be fine.
Yeah. I've been worked in the game industry for 10 years. Shipped products on lots of different platforms, consoles, PC, phones, things like that. So, anyways. When it comes to the Steam Deck, I'm going to hope to bring some of that kind of perspective. And Wendell was one of the first people I wanted to talk to because of this, because I really wanted more insight on the Linux perspective. I did ask a bunch of developers what it's going to be like. So for those who are listening that might not be aware, it looks like the Steam Deck runs on a version of SteamOS, which is based on a Linux distribution that you would know the name of, Wendell?
Debian?
Sorry, which one?
Debian, I think.
Okay. So it's based on this specific distribution. They're going to be doing a bunch of updates before, so it wouldn't be amazingly helpful to look into what performance is like right now, because they're going to be updating Proton and probably the base Linux distro before release. So should be a lot of changes in that regard. But I have a lot of questions myself. So one of the things that I was interested in is, like, with Steam Deck, what are developers like? It doesn't look like they're releasing. We've reached out at my work. We haven't heard back from Valve yet, so I don't know the details on this. We have pretty good relationships with Steam otherwise, but one of the big things that we're curious about is there any way to target this directly? Because it sounds like to us from Valve's perspective that the dev kits are more or less just early Steam Deck, so you can at least do your QA on it. And that's good. Obviously, knowing how it performs might encourage people to make a different performance mode, or if there are specific effects that you see tanking it when you're profiling, you might reduce or have a low version of your game that, or a medium version of the game that emits some of those effects or half reses them or something like that. But yeah, I'm curious what your thoughts are and what we would have to do as devs to target this. Like, to me, it looks like we would likely need to port our games to Linux, and I have thoughts on that. We can get into that, as well as target Vulkan as the API. And we don't want to target OpenGL. We do not want to target OpenGL. So
yeah, OpenGL was one of those things where the artists and the programmers, they didn't get together. They didn't go to lunch. They should have gone to lunch together.
They should have.
It's hard to predict, but there's some really interesting things that have happened historically that suggests to me that Valve sort of knows what they're doing with how to handle this. And so the shortest answer is, I don't think you're going to have to do anything super special to target the platform. I think most of your work is probably going to be around the controls, but even that I don't think is going to be a lot of work. And so if we look at what's happened historically, one really interesting thing, I think it was DirectX 9. There's this real-time Vulkan translation thing, like the DXVK, like the DirectX to Vulkan translation layer. And there's a couple of things that have spun out of that, some funded by Valve and some from crazy people that can see in 9 dimensions because they're super crazy programmers. And some of the things that have fallen out of that is like the ability to run certain older versions of DirectX faster than native on modern hardware. And it's because the older versions of DirectX on modern hardware, no one is actually bothering to maintain anymore. And having the real-time translation layer, if you fix all the bugs, because it's not exactly a one-to-one mapping, you get better performance kind of automatically. And
this is probably intercepting all calls for specific hardware features, and it's translating them on the fly to Vulkan. So there is, in theory, especially on a really unoptimized API, opportunities there for actually performance improvements versus. Yeah. But there's also a lot of opportunities for regression. Both are possible.
Yeah. Well, sometimes you get a hardware assist. So like the hardware of the day, couldn't do culling the way that modern hardware does culling. And so like you add a lot of overhead trying to deal with that programmatically, computationally, because now logic that you just loaded into a buffer and let the hardware deal with, you have to do a little bit of logic on. But if you get back some of the performance because all of that happens in hardware, then mostly it's a win. The specific example I'm thinking of is like GTA 5. Because GTA 5, I mean, it's a popular game, and theoretically, you would think Rockstar's actually put a lot of optimization into it. Of course, I can't 100% say that with a straight face, because half the loading time is improperly parsing JSON.
I
see you, Rockstar. I see what you do. But, theoretically, a lot of optimization has gone into that, and some of it, you can't run it online because you've basically modified somebody else's game, but you can run it a little faster on more modern graphics APIs than it would run on the older graphics APIs. Although GTA 5 is not the best example for another reason, which is they implement some of those. They added the support for that over the years. So
I have a question based on this. If you mind if I intercept for a second? So obviously RDNA 2 has like a set feature set that's unlikely to get targeted on PC, right? Unless something helps, either the APIs take advantage of it or we target it more directly. So like, I think, is sampler feedback culling, a new modern culling method? Do you have any idea what that specifically is as an RDNA 2 feature?
No, I have. It's relatively opaque because if you look at how Vega evolved into RDNA 1, they did a lot of really clever things with the architecture to carry forward some of the functionality from Vega.
So you're talking about like primitive shaders turning into mesh shaders and some other aspects?
Yes, I don't have the depth to really speak about it in terms of like the teeny tiny, like the minutia, but things that used to take like 4 clocks on Vega could still take 4 clocks on RDNA, but you could do some other things in parallel, or you could target it and have it take 1 clock instead of 4 clocks, depending on what your particular goals were. So you wouldn't have to do a lot of re-engineering in your game, but you could open it up and be like, okay, we built this for Vega. We can get more performance, or we can do another pass with more filters or whatever, and it's going to run the same amount of time.
Okay. I'm trying to wrap my head around this. So I'm like, uh, I'm thinking of like what it's going to take to get the most out of this. Because if we just talk about the base spec, so it's like, it looks like probably 512 shaders. So it's double the shaders of a Switch, right? And it's double the clocks. So at just a stock flops comparison, it's basically a 4 times performance increase over a Nintendo Switch. And then when you add the architecture shift going from, what is it? It's basically equivalent to the 900 series, which was Maxwell on Nvidia. So going from Maxwell to RDNA 2, I'd guess would be maybe like a 20 to 30% performance increase as well. So we're looking at something roughly 5 to 6 times more powerful than a Switch. And the question is, going from a closed ecosystem where they can really target that, the 256 shaders of the Switch and so on, versus an open ecosystem where we're more likely to lose performance from API overhead, just the way that the games are built, not being able to target it as directly, just what you typically lose. So, like, I don't know. What are your thoughts on some of that?
There's a lot of things that are happening in parallel, like Samsung and the whole RDNA thing, and mobile and the whole. So I think your numbers are a little optimistic overall, because they're probably going to target much better power efficiency.
Yes.
And if we look at the last few desktop generations, it's like power efficiency, we're way on the other side of that bathtub curve.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Your numbers are a little optimistic, I think.
Well, no, I'm talking about theoretical performance, not in-game performance, right? So I'm expecting it to be like, this is like, if you talk about what the hardware is in theory, if you had both of them in like an environment where you could just write one game for each of them separately, as accurately to the point as you can, you get probably somewhere between 4 to 6 times the performance on the Steam Deck versus the Switch. But that's not the case, because with Nvidia's direct API for the Switch, the Nintendo API, you can target the hardware much more directly and optimize more directly, versus the Steam Deck, where I'm not sure we're going to be getting that. So I'm guessing myself to see like a 2 to 3 times performance increase. That's like my lowest expectation. That's my low stance.
That's probably more accurate, because I'm trying to think about, like, on the Linux side, there's the binary blob. We still have to deal with the binary blob, even though AMD GPU is pretty open. Mm-hmm. And we're sort of dependent on AMD to stick some of that functionality in the binary blob and document it in such a way that we can actually use it. So you guys as game developers, will you have access to special sauce in something that's otherwise open in a way that gives you more direct access to the hardware? That kind of thing. Will it even matter in the end with the resolution and the specs and what you're targeting? I don't think. I guess I would say that in terms of, like, Steam Deck as a Switch thing, will somebody target that specific set of hardware? I don't think so. I don't think Valve will even want you to do that.
But I'm not talking about hardware. I'm talking about features. Okay, so let me give you a really specific example. This might help it out. So, Vega and Vega 56 and 64 introduced half floats, right? Yeah. In your workloads. And we saw them used in literally no games on PC, even though they're used on console games fairly regularly on the PS4 Pro as a means to push the performance higher. And you see it even on Switch, because the Switch can do half floats, which is odd because Nvidia disabled it with the 3000 series. By the looks of things, you get same half float performance as full float. 32-bit versus 16, I think.
Interesting.
They
probably did that to avoid competing with their workstation cards.
Mm. I'm curious.
A whole dimension of crazy.
Well, so the funny thing is that Nvidia added half floats to the 2000 series, and we actually saw a small pocket of games targeted. I think Wolfenstein 2 did. They targeted half floats so that we have mixed precision workloads in there. And then what happened is you would see all of a sudden, if you look at those benchmarks for the game, Vega 64 and 56 would jump up a couple slots in their GPUs, when this feature that was never used, it was never targeted for Radeon, was finally available on a set of Nvidia cards too, then you saw some games start to utilize it, and then you got to see some hardware utilization. So my question is like RDNA 2 is pretty feature rich as far as I'm seeing. You know, you have variable rate shading, you have mesh shading, you have sampler feedback, you have is there anything else I'm missing? There's probably a few things. But there's a bunch of things that we can start targeting in engines, but they have to be in engines available for developers to implement easily for us to see performance. And there has to be incentive on PC. And this is something I mentioned on Moore's Law is Dead, is like game developers are hoping that like the minimum spec on PC shifts to like a 3060 or something. So we can at least have our full feature set to target. Because if there's still people with like a 1050 or heaven forbid like a 750 or an RX 470 or something in 2 years, then we're going to be not using the features that are available in GPUs the way that they could be.
So I think the answer to that, one of the answers to that is why that has not been the case on PC is because I think probably the lag time between the drivers and the hardware and then like the game engines. Because on a console platform, that time is basically zero. Like AMD is able to, when you're working with like Xbox and PS5 or whatever, they're able to just sort of make that available at a software level, work directly with developers, and everything is good to go. If you look at some of the experiments that we've done with Unreal Engine, some of the ray tracing stuff in Unreal Engine, the functionality is there in AMD cards, but like the development environment for developers is a little sketchy and unpredictable in weird ways, even though the ray tracing stuff is there. And some of it is a feature, not a bug, because you do something in the Unreal environment and it's like, okay, calculate the ray tracing this way. And the card is trying to do that, but you're getting an unexpected result because of interaction with something else going on in the scene. And those kinds of teething issues are between, the game engine and like AMD and the AMD's driver team, and AMD's driver team being pulled in 17 different directions and everything else. And because that's not all under one roof, that's going to produce an extra 6 months plus of lag time probably.
Yeah. Well, so you're talking about the 6 months lag time pulling into PC versus consoles. I mean, console time, the feature can exist right away, right? And then AMD would probably work with the vendors, but then getting engine integration and patches within engines. And the other thing that a lot of people don't know about games is a lot of times game developers, if they start developing a game, and I know we do this in Unity, and I'm sure Unreal developers do it too. If you're working on a stable build of your game and you're in a stable build of that software, you can be still using that build 2 years out. You can be on Unity 2016 or Unreal 2016 for your game, because you're more scared of introducing new bugs than you are of getting these new features. And this is usually what happens when you start a new game. Then you're like, oh, let's jump to whatever the latest build is right now that we get. Even you Google it a bit and see which is the newest build that's stable, right? And then you start building your new game in that, and then you get a chance to play with those features. But oftentimes, from the vast majority, I mean, there's some very technical developers that are willing to do the hurdles to get more of the features in all the time, like. Obviously the developers of like Control and Metro and all of that are crazy when it comes to stuff. Most of them make their own tools and stuff, but for the average developer, they want to make sure their game is stable, so they're a little bit scared to implement these new features.
Even outside the game engine, you have the exact same thing. Just like looking at the AMD GPU driver, it's like, oh, variable refresh rate. It's okay. The hardware is there. The primitives are there in AMD GPU, but does the compositor handle that? Is this a Wayland compositor thing, or is this something we're going to port to, something for like pre-Wayland? Do we expose this in a way that games can get at it? Is this something that Steam can help with? If Steam replaces this sort of low-level thing that's operating in the kernel, does this actually make sense for something that would be mainlined into a distro, or is this going to be something that has to live in Steam's and Valve's version of their own distro? There's even non-graphical examples of that. There's a programming construct in Windows that has to do with mutexes and semaphores. And Windows has this thing that a lot of games use to notify a lot of things that are waiting that, hey, there's data now, you can go do stuff. And in Linux, it's like a queue, I guess. And on Windows, it's handled sort of locklessly. And there's not a primitive in the Linux kernel. There wasn't a primitive in the Linux kernel to do that. And so Valve had to submit a patch to handle that. And it was kind of like, we're only adding this to support Windows games because there's too much computational overhead for translating this into the kind of construct that Linux uses because games are kind of performance sensitive.
Hmm.
And so there's a million little things like that from bare metal all the way up to inside the game engine.
Man. Yeah. So I don't even know where to go from that. I'm having a hard time tracking some of it myself. I'm
I'm not that kind of programmer. I like learning about that stuff. And the AMD driver team is super busy and they've got it. Like they've got the detail down and they've got all the other stuff. And so
mhm.
some of these problems will go away because they have the money now and they also have the interest from studios. I mean, when AMD was, this big, they couldn't go to Unreal and be like, "Hey, we got this thing. You need to work on this stuff." Blah blah blah.
Yeah, they
Like,
wouldn't
yeah,
be able to.
we're going to
They
sell
wouldn't
that to
care
like
to.
5 people. We don't care.
Yeah.
But now they've got some real hardware, and so it's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem. And so maybe these timelines are going to get shorter, and these problems will get solved a lot quicker.
It's kind of interesting when like a lot of people don't. I mean, the last few games that I've worked on targeted PC first and spec'd otherwise, but AAA developers often do the inverse. They'll start on console and then they'll port to PC. I remember when I was at GDC 2018, I had a sit down at a restaurant with someone that just did, at that point in time, one of the most successful PC ports of a game, and I'm not going to mention it because just in case, but they did, and people were commenting on how well optimized and whatnot this specific PC port was, and that developer told me that they wished that they never had to port to PC. And I thought that was a really funny perspective, right, from this developer wishing that PC didn't exist as an ecosystem after doing one of the most successful optimized PC ports. And I was,
That's not super surprising, really.
yeah, I mean, it was to me at the time because it's like I live in two spaces. I usually work at like a small studio making a game, right? But then the other part of me is like deep in tech, computer hardware stuff, trying to understand where things are going, what'll things look like, just speculating what games will be like in the future, which is something that I personally obsess about. And it's like this kind of weird split in me. So when you kind of see what it's actually like for people in this, because I'd say that in general the PC gaming public has a very different perception than the developers that I've talked to that work on PC. And this all kind of ties into the Steam Deck, because the big problem with PC from a developer's standpoint is it's very hard to target it directly, right?
Yeah.
Like they're not sure what to look at. So like if the Steam Deck became like the lower end standard of it and they had something to shoot for that they can guarantee that, and it really depends on adoption, because if it sells, even if it sold, I'd say, 4 or 5 million units in the first year or two, it probably wouldn't be enough to move a needle. But if it sells 20, then all of a sudden people are going to start looking at it, or 30 million, you know what I mean? So, and this is kind of why I wanted to get into the specifics of it. Like, what happens if it just took a giant portion of market share? What would we have to change in our development structure? Would we end up, would that just be targeting Vulkan and porting to Linux? Now, I messaged just a bunch of developers I knew had done Linux ports in the past. And the perception was kind of, I'm not going to say anyone specifically, but they basically, most of them said that they were one of the hardest people to please because they would spend all of this time porting and then they would release it and they would get more negative reviews from Linux gamers, even though they tried really hard to release a Linux distribution, like a Linux version of the game. And then if they just didn't release the Linux version, they would have less headache and they would just play it on Windows somehow, or either through a virtual machine or whatever they do to play it on Windows, and they wouldn't end up complaining about the Linux port. And that was that perception.
I like I like I like what is happening with Proton. I'm really excited by it, and it is a really great, amazing project. But there's a part of me that thinks like, all of the cruft and insanity of Windows, we're bringing all of that along, trying to deal with that layer. But at the same time, the environment has got to be better than what it is on Windows. And I think that a lot of developers don't have that experience, because like the lower levels, like the kernel and the command line stuff and that kind of stuff for Linux, is it's the pinnacle of civilization.
Yeah, yeah.
Modern man, it's like the greatest thing ever. But then, the graphical environment built on top of that really isn't that amazing. I mean, but we're still Wayland has been coming for like 5 years now. And so there are a lot of acknowledged problems, but there's also a huge amount of inertia, and it literally can't get here fast enough.
Well,
And
is
so I
this
get, uh huh,
well, sorry, is this a problem that you mentioned earlier, right? So
yeah,
you mentioned to me that I'm obscure because I'm an artist who cares about tech in a way that most don't. And
yeah,
this is kind of Linux's biggest problem in a nutshell, that
yeah,
it doesn't have people fine tuning the interface to make it more manageable for them. And those people would be luring the artists into the ecosystem, right? And this is like, I actually work with a bunch of really good programmers, right? And they will develop like a shader or something for me to use in a game. And then they'll pass it to me, and then I'll break it or I'll use it wrong. And then I mention it, and then they're like, one of them is like really amazing about it. He's like, no, that just tells me that you weren't understanding it, so I have to change how it functioned. So I've changed it from being a value that you type into a slider because it does look crazy. It's like it actually operates between 0.01 and 1, but by having a value, you can type in 500 and you get really weird results. So it's hard to know where to make your range for a visual like shader effect, right? So it's like it's one of these weird things. So it's like when the developer develops that tool for me, and then I make it, I'm like, this isn't working, or I'm like, how do I do this with it? And then I send it back, and they're like, and it's cool to see them making those kind of concessions, but this is what you need for Linux to take off.
yeah, yeah. And often not enough investment in that, because open source, the love of open source, it's all really great and stuff, but it takes spending a lot of money. And I think Valve has done it right. Valve has greased an ungodly number of palms, probably untold dollars, but they don't want to talk about it, and they don't want their developers to talk about it. They just find people and they're like, you're really good at doing what you do. This is the general direction we need you to go in. These are the technical requirements. We will fund you if you want to do this. Just, don't talk about it. Don't make a big deal about it. Just go.
Mm.
And, the cat kind of came out of the bag surreptitiously with like DXVK and some of the other stuff. It was like, people are working on this. I don't know what the details are behind that, but it seems like a little cloak and dagger, a little bit intrigue. Maybe the story's more interesting than, or the imagined story is more interesting than reality.
Yeah. It's a bunch of programmers, right? So it's probably a lot nerdier. Just
yeah,
we imagine this like secret underground society, but it's probably just like 6 people in a weird circle on computers.
yeah. But it is really exciting that those things, and we will get there eventually. Like supporting legacy and supporting old stuff and supporting this, that, and the other. We will get there eventually. I think here's something maybe that you haven't thought about, but is very related to what we're doing. So with the Switch, the Nintendo Switch, and also, Valve's Steam Deck, get
Mhm.
that right. Uh, the importance of that thing doing computation is getting to be less and less and less important, which dramatically increases the device lifetime potentially.
Mm-hmm.
So
Because you're not pushing the hardware as hard, consistently dropping its ability to hit those clocks at that voltage.
yes, so where we are right now today with H.265,
Mm-hmm.
low latency streaming encoding, and the hardware Wi-Fi interface on the proposed hardware here, and even to a certain extent the Switch, if there is a desire and impetus to support, which is easier in the open source ecosystem, those devices as remote devices for whatever the game machine du jour is, and I'm not saying that could be cloud or local or whatever, then it becomes much less important that that thing have a lot of computational horsepower.
I'm kind of
So
split on this myself, and this is like specifically streaming to an object. Well, first of all, one of the big caveats is when you're not running it locally, right? Then it's like internet's obviously super important. And the other aspect of it is, well, either your network if you're in your house, or internet, or like literally like cellular internet, talking like 5G or whatever when you're out. And like, do these devices even have radios for that, right? It's like, do you want to have a phone plan on your Switch or your Steam Deck? Maybe someday you will, right? But it's like, that's part of where we're not at yet. And the other part is like, it's kind of weird, like even energy savings wise, it's like, it's kind of a weird thing. I have 3 kids, right? So it's like I like playing PC games, I like playing console games, I like playing any big games. But the truth is, 90% of the time that I actually play games is with my kids on the Switch. And I think it's funny that I have a, 40 teraflop computer sitting here and I'm playing on a 500 gigaflop Switch with my kids, right? And this is like, it's a funny scenario where you have some of the best hardware and then you end up using it. And I get that, hardcore PC gamers will be on their PC more doing that kind of thing. But it's like, the kind of the beauty of the Steam Deck is running these things at all at 15 watts, right? Like, yeah. And
I mean, you could play it locally. It could be a thing. It depends on the game, I guess.
Yeah.
And the network connection and all the other stuff. But the thing that changed my mind, I thought along the same lines, but what changed my mind was I built a Pi Boy DMG, which is it's a Raspberry Pi, vaguely reminiscent, but for the purposes of copyright, entirely distinct from the old school Nintendo Game Boy. And it's got a decent, but not high resolution at all. It's like 640 by something LCD screen. And it has a reasonably long lithium polymer battery life. And you've got all your classic games on it and your emulators, and it can play some stuff locally. But it is also a heck of a machine for streaming from Steam. And I've done the Wi-Fi hotspot thing off of my phone and streamed to that remotely with a VPN, and it's not been a completely awful experience. So with things like Elon Musk's, global satellite internet and 5G plus, that stable and also wireless connection and also relatively low latency connection becomes more of a possibility. Is that right now today, even 5G America? No, not really, because like if I'm playing on a long enough timeline, it's pretty glitchy. But if I'm playing Factorio, which was in the thing, that was in their video, if I'm playing Factorio on the Pi Boy DMG, it's not a completely awful experience.
I just keep thinking of like my phone plan. I locked into an unlimited plan like 13 years ago at $30, and I'm not changing it because $30 for unlimited internet on a phone, it's like I'm never changing that thing ever. But it's like it's kind of a funny thing. It's like, what am I going to do? Take out that SIM card and put it in whatever device this is when the time comes? It's like, I mean, latency is always an issue when it comes to streaming these kind of things, right? And the not necessarily that the moment to moment latency is bad, is that crucial moments of latency can hit you in a way that maybe wouldn't hit you locally. And I like just like weird spikes or outages or things like that. I mean, that would hurt you if you're playing an online game anyways, but it's weirder when it's your entire video feed. Like you feel like you're cut off from doing anything at that point in time. So it's like I can see somewhat that being the future and streaming your desktop onto the Switch, but onto the Steam Deck. But if you're doing that, right, it's like now you're using whatever. Let's say your desktop uses 500 watts. Now you're using 515 watts to have it on and be somewhere else, right? It's like it's this funny scenario where it's like, I mean, I'm curious to see what this device can do, right? I'm wondering if, because the big thing we were talking about earlier is like, you're talking theoretically 4 to 6 times Switch performance in game, maybe less, maybe 3. Would having a game ported directly to Linux and Vulkan, what percentage of that do you think we could scrape out of this device?
I think if the platform is optimized to the nth degree, I think that will be surprising, because I always go back to like the Doom Eternal port with Vulkan. And the performance they were able to squeeze out of that. When that game launched, it was jaw-dropping. It's like, is this what an optimized game with Vulkan looks like? Because it was insane.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you and I, we never published it, but you and I ran some tests on variable rate shading. And variable rate shading and mesh shading, when you run those demos on 3D Marks, it's like you look at variable rate shading, and it seems to have the tier 2 seems to have a slight performance advantage on Radeon compared to Nvidia from a base. It's close, but it seems like there's a slight advantage to Radeon with variable rate shading. And with mesh shading, it's kind of weird because the Nvidia demo starts out at a much higher frame rate than if you run the same test on a Radeon, on like a 6900 XT versus a 3090. But the performance gain percentage is much higher on a Radeon with mesh shading on. So part of me is wondering, like, we're not technically fully utilizing the Steam Deck until all of these features are turned on.
Yeah.
From my perspective, we're not seeing what the hardware can theoretically do until we're using its full feature set. And getting
Sometimes that never comes to pass, though. You got to.
we have historically. So this is the question that I'm saying is this device going to make a big enough of a splash for that reality to come true? And how can we target it, right? This is the thing. How do we target all of these features? We're talking about, really, I mean, everyone should be pushing their game engines towards mesh shaders, variable rate shading, and all of that for the future. That's what we should be doing, right?
I think we just end up targeting Linux with RDNA.
Yeah.
And it ends up basically being the same thing.
Yeah. It's kind of funny that Vulkan's based off of Mantle. Come on, full circle.
I was thinking about, as you said that, and porting and the available features. Have you seen some of the insane projects like people have ported Mario Brothers or a Mario Brothers-like game that is similar to, but for the purposes of copyright holders,
yes.
from
the
Mario on an Atari 2600? It's like we can play Super Mario Brothers on an Atari 2600. Yes, but not really because those development tools did not exist at that time, and it also looks way different, but it plays similarly.
Yeah, well, wasn't that there's a story behind? I don't know if it was Carmack or someone doing that. He outright ported.
They did a Mario on the IBM PC.
Well, at that point in time, scrolling didn't exist on PC. This is a time when hardware.
To do that.
Yeah, this was a time when PC hardware was actually behind consoles in some ways. So, like from having specific pixel art feature sets built into consoles for acceleration, right? It's kind of funny that we say this because I know from doing pixel art that there's a lot of ways, like you could never do pixel art in a game today using the RAM utilizations you could on like a DS or a Game Boy Advance or a SNES. There was so much fixed hardware to target like each of those transformations or like tiles specifically, right? That we just don't have that. Our hardware is built differently now. So we do it in other ways. It's like even like the versions of Unity and Unreal, when we put 2D assets in, it's like a hacked framework to create 2D sprites. And it's like the 2D games we play now are still secretly 3D. And that's a difference, right? That's a big difference when it comes to these hardware things. So we're talking about, we're jumping over the place a little bit, but like game development, like Steam Deck targeting hardware, right? This is kind of what all of this comes down to. Is this something we can target the way that we want to target? It's like I see all of these YouTubers specifically. It's like my themes being filled with Steam Deck things, with all these people being excited. And it's like I think immediately it will give you everything up to PS4 portable, right? Yeah. Like you'll be able to play all of your games up to PS4 basically portable. And some of the higher end games might not run as well as you like, and some of them might run way better, like Doom Eternal, or I would bet even the Decima engine games would probably run pretty well. But, like Death Stranding or Horizon Zero Dawn, there's specific things that I think would target the hardware well and work well on it, and then there might be some surprise cases where it's just like, this doesn't run that great.
Yeah, I think that's, I think that's likely. But I think the thing that is going to surprise everybody about this, the hardware, is that it's going to have longevity that the Switch probably doesn't. One of the great things about the DS and like the original Game Boy, like the clamshell Game Boy, is that you can just pick one of those up and you can play the old games. And some people do that, and it basically works from now until the end of time. I hope it's like that with this, where if you've got your whole library on it, you get the 1 terabyte model. You can just pick it up and go. Steam kind of wants to be online. It kind of wants a whole bunch of other stuff. But it would be amazing if, 10 or 15 years from now, like some of Nintendo's products, you're able to do that with a PC without sort of needing good old games to have, containerized it in some way so that it runs in a modern way.
It's not going to be like Proton 5000 that just translates everything to Vulkan no matter what?
I mean, maybe that could happen. But I think that because that device will have such a very long, useful lifetime, I think that the kind of porting that you're talking about is kind of inevitable if it gets the numbers, because it just builds cumulatively. If they do like a second version or whatever, it's like, well, we can count on H.265 streaming, for both of these. And so even if it doesn't run natively, you could still stream it. And it's a little bit of a second-class experience. But at the end of its useful lifetime, it's only just doing streaming. But that's kind of I mean, that's fine. That kind of makes sense. I think that'll work well.
Well, and being a history device, right? It's like,
Yeah.
now that kind of brought up a weird question that just crossed my head that I wasn't planning on at all. It's like, okay, so a lot of these devices that you mentioned, like Game Boy Advance, DS, things like this, they didn't have like an active cooling solution. There's no fans or anything, right? It was like bare silicon, and they had it like underclocked as much as possible to make sure heating would never be an issue, right? And that's why some of these devices have these longevity. It's like I can't walk into a computer store without someone going in for laptop repairs because the fans kicked out on it or something like that, right? It's like literally every time I walk into a computer store, there's someone there with an upside down laptop pointing at the fan. And it's like,
if they sell enough of these, I mean, yeah, that is a little bit of a concern. But if they sell enough of these, that probably won't be like a super insane concern. There's another device that I love, the HP 100LX 200LX Palm Top.
oh yeah, I've heard you talk about
Palm
this.
Top, and it's a 186. It's a 286 without some features. It's an 80186. It runs off two AA batteries, and you can get 40 hours of power on time out of an x86 processor.
That's
Crazy.
That's unbelievable.
Even though it was DOS in a Windows era, it still had a useful lifetime into the Windows 98 era, which is insane for DOS. It's probably one of the longest lived DOS platforms ever. It has a cult following, and it's crazy.
Yeah.
If this thing is as popular as I think it'll be, it will probably have a cult following from now until the end of time.
You look at Vita, right?
Yeah.
Vita's very much like that. Like the PlayStation Vita has more. It had such a short window of active developer support, but the thing just lives on despite that. And when Sony tried to
and openness,
when
back to the thing that you said at the very beginning, where it's like it's closed, now it's open, and then look, it lives on.
Yeah, it lives on. Well, most devices are hacked initially just to put Linux on it, right? So it's like
Can it run Doom?
yeah, with the original Doom. Let's see how it does. Anyways, I think it's a kind of funny train of thought. There was something that you triggered there with me. I'm trying to get back to it mentally. Why don't you say a few things and I'll see if I can find.
No, just like it's like the device has legs, you know. It's just
I remember now. I was gonna say, so it's like I bet your forums are already on this, right? It's like, what's this? This is like the livelihood of your forums. So like, oh, we're gonna get like a community that is gonna be maybe even a bit bigger. That when we write stuff for, they're gonna be looking for our software immediately to use, and it's like the window of people accessing and modifying their software is gonna go up dramatically for a period of time, right?
Yeah, this is kind of a no-brainer though, because look at like the GPD Win and other people like that. That's like, I'm going to build a device that is exactly what I want. And on the forum, to your point, there are a lot of people that are taking devices like that, and they're like, I'm going to take it apart and modify it. I'm going to do a replacement motherboard for this thing that I think that they got everything particularly right. I can keep using the input peripherals, no problem. But so it's like I can do a hardware replacement on this, horribly ancient thing with something that's a little less ancient. And even though it's proprietary, having a custom circuit board made these days, yeah, I can probably get some other people to do it with me and Kickstarter it, and we'll be good to go. And so like GPD did that. Yeah. And now GPD has like a whole line of stuff that's basically kind of a predecessor, and it's been insanely popular.
Well, I think about like the weird side markets for several of these things, because it's like RetroTink with their like old displays.
Software emulation is not good enough. We must have an FPGA, which if you think about it, it's like, if you're into that, that makes sense. Let's do it.
Yeah. The funny thing is that I kept misspeaking FPGA as FGPA just because for some reason my brain says PGA. It's like golf, and I want to shift those letters.
We all have our own stream decks. It's fine.
I'm like, field programmable gate array. I need to say it correctly. It's like you misspeak all the time when you're on video. It's hard to, even if you know the things, you might just say the wrong word, and when you rewatch the video, you're like, oh, I said it wrong.
I struggle because in my mind, it's just a series of images, and it's just like, and it's like, slow down, I have to convert this to words, and I say the wrong words all the time.
Yeah, I'm kind of like that too with images as well. So Yeah, I guess I'll go to some of these topics here. So, what do you think this is going to have a significant shift in Linux adoption for average consumers? Obviously, Linux is crazy in servers and several other places, but I mean for the average user, do you think this is
I
going to be
think
the biggest
it'll
up we take?
I think it'll have a knock-on effect, but I think the fact that Linux is in play is completely transparent to the end user. Like the fact that Android, has a Linux kernel underneath hasn't really mattered for Linux adoption. And so in this same context, I think that that is still going to matter. Now, will the work that Valve is doing be lift and shiftable over to the Linux environment? Yes.
Hmm.
And ultimately, I think it'll be up to game developers and members of the community to do that. I don't think it's going to fall out of having this with no effort. So you'll have a positive knock on effect, but I don't think that you're going to have a market where people are like, yes, I must have the Linux.
Okay. However, the only thing that I could see maybe changing that is if like Linux developers, like or just individual people that write things for Linux, write such useful programs that people are drawn to the platform. From like, oh, I have a Steam Deck and I was able to pull this cool mod in, or I was able to do this, right? And modify the game or the ecosystem in this way that's really interesting. And then they go to Windows and they're locked from being able to do that. Those kind of things can be more persuasive, right, for the average user. They don't want to go nitty gritty with code. They don't want to go like trying to figure these things. But if there's a feature that they find easy to implement and use in a specific ecosystem that they can talk about and communicate easily, right? That has potential to catch on. And then when you get
Microsoft,
artists, sorry, go ahead.
go ahead.
No, you go
I
ahead.
was going to say, Microsoft is ahead of you there, and this has already played out for web developers. So like web developing, depending on what you're doing and depending on the languages and a whole bunch of other things, doing certain kinds of development on Mac, like Brew kind of sucks, and the old Bash kind of sucks, and like Mac OS is kind of rotting from the inside out. Like it's a pretty veneer, but there's a lot of bugs, and if you're a developer, it's a special kind of suffering.
Mm.
Linux has a different kind of suffering, and Windows is just completely unprepared for doing, that kind of development on the web. But the Windows subsystem for Linux, oh my gosh, it is transformational because you can have your little sandbox. You could run Docker or micro Kubernetes or whatever. You can have your little environment on your Windows box that's just like your server box in the cloud, and all of the tools work really well because they're all really up to date, and you don't have odd problems because Bash is from 1785 or because Brew did something weird to try to get your Bash version to not be from the dawn of time.
Yeah.
And uh, so Windows finally now with the Windows terminal and everything else, it is an incredible first class experience for those kinds of things. So if somebody does to your point, if somebody does write a really amazing widget that makes life easy and does some stuff on, Linux, blah blah blah, it's immediately available on Windows. The,
Mm.
the reverse is not true on Linux. If you want to be able to run Windows stuff, your only way to do it now is like seamlessly run a virtual machine. And we're, as far as I know, the people that are always writing the how-tos and doing the stuff on that so that you can run your Windows apps seamlessly on Linux. But you're basically running a full-fat virtual machine. You can do a full-fat virtual machine with GPU acceleration, but that's the only thing that has guaranteed compatibility. And if it's not for anti-cheats, that works really well for gaming too. And we've also got some technologies that'll let you, run an accelerated game transparently alongside Windows and the how-tos and stuff that go with that. And now we have some questionably okay with the manufacturer scripts like vGPU unlock, which will turn your GeForce card into a card that can actually share a workload between two different heterogeneous operating systems.
Now, is this where IOMMU groups come into play?
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
groups come into play when you've got multiple GPUs and you need to separate one GPU and one group for one virtual machine versus another GPU and another group for
I,
another virtual machine.
I think I heard Robert Halleck in a talk from AMD. It was like a technical talk. Literally say IOMMU groups and said Wendell will get a kick out of this. And I'm like, did Robert Halleck just nod to Wendell? And
I literally was the guy 5 years ago that showed up and was like, we need to get on top of this because, look, if you're going to have like all the old operating system baggage, I think that like for computers, computing in general, and computing hygiene and security, we cannot spend the time. The human existence is is too amazing and too awesome to force people to work on this. When we make a mistake, we should be able to abandon the past. But instead, what happens is we have to maintain that mistake until the end of time. And so, whatever weird quirk the Windows 95 API had for calculating the date, or whatever you had, there's thousands of man years of programmer time to be able to support that. All the weird quirks and crazy stuff that's in Proton for dealing with Windows games is recreating something that already exists and is miserable on the Windows platform. Look, if we can just figure out this virtual machine thing, we can package it all up in a container, and when we need to go into the past, we can go into the past in the container, but we are not encumbered by it. We have...
But you get performance regression, don't you, from doing that?
It depends on how much hardware acceleration you have. So, like, because enterprises need this level of separation to do their stuff, in order for Amazon to be Amazon and make $1 trillion, they need there to not be performance regressions. It's really the same thing. And so now in hardware, we have this really amazing stuff to deal with all this. So MMU is one way to do that, because you can, the memory management unit can talk to the host operating system and be like, hey, this hypervisor or this virtual machine is running in this context in this hypervisor. It's got this little sandbox. Let me know if it does anything to try to escape that.
Yeah.
And because it's handled in hardware, there's no performance regression. We also have it for interrupts now. So you can have virtualized interrupts where the virtual machine has a software interrupt or a hardware interrupt from your GPU that's passed from the physical hardware to the virtual machine without the host operating system having to do a thing. So yeah, there's a little overhead, but it's minimal. And if you look at, you know, the human suffering that went into having to build out this overly elaborate thing versus, okay, we lost 1% performance, but computers in general are now 10% faster. It was not worth the time to...
This works in the server space, and it works with like legacy game space. It doesn't work in like current game development. Anytime you're developing anything currently, I'm trying to think, I'm like, oh, we're going to lose some people listening to all of this, but no, it's good. Like, I would love this stuff, but it's like, I'm like, if you're going over my head, I'm like, I don't know what mostly, but it's one of these weird things, right? Because it's like, we gotta keep focused on the Steam Deck a bit, but I'm like, oh, this is also very fascinating. It's like, I shouldn't have brought up IO MMU.
To bring it back to, like, you were talking about, it's like you have your game set up and it's set up in like 2016 and you don't want to introduce any new bugs.
Yeah.
Suppose the environment were architected in such a way that, you know, we're walking around our virtual reality. It's a 3D space. We're wandering around a Doom map that was built, you know, with, it has their own thing, but just bear with me. Mm-hmm. You know, we're wandering around our environment that looks suspiciously like Doom, but for the purposes of copyright is not built in the Unity engine. Mm-hmm. And everything works and is really good. It's like now that was 2016. Now it's 2020, and we're going to come out with a remastered version. We want to do a whole bunch of other stuff. Suppose you could have everything as it existed in 2016, that code path, all of that code with all of its warts and everything else exists. But because the coordinate system and the 3D space or whatever is common and shared and well architected, we can just roll that project into 2020 and be able to add things to the environment and interact things with the environment. And there's an API layer that'll let the two different versions talk to one another. And we could add new assets and new interaction and update things in the 2020 version, but be assured that any changes that have been made in the 2020 version won't interfere with anything that exists in the 2016 version unless we specifically select that object or select that part of the environment and say, no, you're part of the 2020 world now. I'm going to deal with any of the consequences and fallout from that.
It's kind of funny that you mentioned that, because this makes me think of Microsoft's strategy for Xbox specifically. And maybe I'm misunderstanding something because I'm not a genius on any of these fronts, but it looks to me like Microsoft shifted its game development ethos from hardware specific to API, like treat Xbox like an API. And if you look at what they do with like retro, it's like Panzer Dragoon Orta, which is like a crazy old Sega. It's an original Xbox rail shooter made by Sega, and I love that game. And it just runs natively on 4K on if you play it on an Xbox One X or Series X. And it's crazy to see this game from, I don't know what, 2004 in 4K all of a sudden, like no jaggies, like perfectly clear. You're like, this is really interesting. But they couldn't do that if they weren't treating their entire ecosystem like an API. And then so it's like it's a completely different way to target game development. It's very different than what you see from, and it's closer in a lot of ways to what Steam is doing. So it's kind of interesting because I listened to someone, I'm trying to remember who it was to give them credit where it's due, but they were talking about how Steam, they said it like a month before the Steam Deck came out, and they were saying that Steam is the only person that could pull off a handheld like this because when you look at GPD Win or the INEO or things like that, they can't hit economy of scale. It's impossible, and they can't recoup hardware costs in software sales. And that's the only PC player that has the chance. Well, there's only two PC players that have the chance to win in that space, and that's Microsoft and Steam. Those are the only two people in that ecosystem that could actually pull this off. And oddly enough, though Microsoft hadn't released a handheld, they had done it by treating their ecosystem like an API, right? And if they do this, like, so if you imagine Xbox does this with like a 9x scaling resolution on classic Xbox games and 6x scaling on Xbox One games or whatever they do, right? They could do that in reverse, couldn't they? Half scaling on a portable, and treat it as an API call. Just call for it to intercept the resolution call and cut it down by half, and then have a handheld without almost any development time from developers.
Yeah, a lot of this archetype, this paradigm, the thing that I'm spouting is not anything new, even in terms of like the computer science architecture of it. There's a thing in Windows called Windows side by side, where different conflicting versions of things are maintained, and that's one of the ways that they're able to support 47 billion versions of .NET and the applications that are built in them, while they can update the version of .NET without retroactively breaking any applications. And so, you know, people inside Microsoft know the pain and suffering and misery of trying to support old stuff, and it's like, well, the more we can stuff that into a box to where we don't have to deal with it, then the better off we're going to be. Because ultimately, it's about the number of pixels that you're pushing and the interface and the latency, and that's really it.
Well, and what your software is trying to do with it, right? Like.
Well, you know, theoretically, like if you have a perfect algorithm, if you have something that is able to fill the screen with, you know, to do a certain amount of calculations and fill all of the pixels in the screen at 60 FPS, then it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
I was at a talk probably 15 years ago-ish from Microsoft. They had just acquired somebody, and they were doing this imaging system, and it was when Microsoft bought Flickr. Remember Flickr? I think was it Flickr? Microsoft bought Flickr. They bought one of the photo things. Yeah. The whole reason Microsoft bought them was to be able to do image research. And they had this wonderful demo of something called Sea Dragon. And I don't think anything ever came of this, but they were like, here's a new document format. It's like a PDF competitor, and how much horsepower you need to process a terabyte of images is not a function of how big your data set is. It's a function of how interactive you want the screen to be, how many pixels you have. And so they had this magazine, and they were like, well, we're flipping through this just like it's a PDF, it's fine. And then there was like a BMW ad, and they like zoomed into the BMW ad, and they just kept on zooming and zooming and zooming, and it was basically infinite resolution because you could get more information and you could get websites and click off to stuff. And
this is like
it's crazy.
This is the talk. Like, we can go back to where engines are going. There's two things I want to say from this, because obviously there's a push in the game industry to have, because your pixels are set, right? And what people don't understand with your game development and with your LODs and stuff like this is your scene is variable, and you make LODs that you set at specific distances or whatnot, right? But sometimes you have like a character model really close on the screen, right? And it has like 7 polygons, or maybe that's exaggeration nowadays, but like it's 100 polygons, right?
2012 Tomb Raider. Woo!
Yeah, it's like 150 polygons filling up like 20% of your pixels, right? And in the far background, you have like a mesh with 60,000 polygons in 4 pixels, right? So it's like, and this is what Nanite is trying to solve in Unreal, and there are other solutions that I've heard of tried for this, because I mean, the render workload for rendering the pixels should be the same, but it's not. But it's so data heavy to do that. So you have to manage your data to be essentially rebuilding the scene on a frame by frame basis to use only the pixels that are necessary. And this is like So this is the one thing I wanted to say from this, and there was another thing that I wanted to say from this. I was trying to remember what it is. So yeah, hardware vendors are attempting to do this, right? To target specific, and mesh shaders are a means to this to some extent, or closer to it, right? Just that your meshes are doing that automatically, and you don't have to make all of the LODs and things like that. So there's like advantages to that. I'm not sure entirely how it works. I'd have to play with it myself, but there's some other thing. You want to segue for a second while I think?
Sure, yeah. No, I mean, the computer science hadn't been invented yet, but we're getting to the point where we do have the computer science, and you do see things like this in the engines that you have, and so those kinds of things will make how much horsepower you need more a function of GPU horsepower than future upgrade technology. Like it's kind of a curve. It's like, okay, we're going to add a ton more computational horsepower, but it didn't really matter. The reason the algorithms, the reverse of this is really easy to understand. You look at the 3090 performance. Look at the 3090 performance at 1080p. Mm-hmm. It's basically the same as 1440p. It's almost the same as 4K. Yeah. 4K is 4 times as many pixels as 1080p. Yeah. Why is 1080p not 4 times the performance? We know that the 3090 can do the computation. Why is it not 4 times? And the answer is the software.
Well, it's partially the software. It's like it is much harder on the so it's harder on output, but not everything in your scene changes, right? It's like you're still mapping the same textures onto your meshes. You're still mapping. Some of these things scale with little performance loss, and some of these things scale with massive. It's just like alpha transparencies and blending on pixels that murders it, right? So it's like if you have like 4 explosions in the foreground and they're all like semi-transparent and they're blending with pixels behind it, the computation on that is insane, right? Versus some things, like there's almost no difference on your hardware in terms of how many pixels it's targeting, and then other things there's a lot of difference, which is why it doesn't scale completely linearly from resolution to resolution, as some things just use different hardware, and some things don't actually push. They don't need the scale, right? They end up pixels in the end, but the way they're done in the pipeline doesn't actually look that way. I hope that I'm representing that accurately.
Yes. Certain things in the pipeline take a finite amount of time, whether it's rendering target is 1080p or 4K. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter. You'd have to go even. That's why I was like, we can do 8K gaming, and it's like, well, not technically untrue. Yeah. But 8K gaming implies that you're gaming at things less than 8K is going to be amazing, and that was not the case.
Yeah, that definitely. And it's kind of funny because you get the inverse scaling with the 6900 XT, which is winning in a lot of cases in 1080p and 1440p, and then losing in 4K. So it's the hardware makeup on both of those things is pretty fascinating. I did think again of what I was going to say before. Oh, some of what we were just talking about is the reason. So like when I was talking with Moore's Law's dad about the draw call issue, and if you work in a game studio, you hear the word, especially if you're targeting PC, you hear draw calls spoken more than almost anything else, especially when you're in the optimizations phase of games. It's like the most common thing you hear developers talking about. And when they're looking, they'll look at, batching their draw calls and things like that when they're actually trying to optimize the game. And the whole issue with why it's an issue, because I think it was Oxide Games who did Ashes of the Singularity and whatnot, and before that they had another game, but they talked about how they thought it was funny because when you worked on consoles you'd have 20 times more draw calls than doing PC in DirectX 11. And that was because at the time, right, it's like DirectX was just built on top of all the previous versions. Going back to like DirectX 1, and this is before we had fixed function hardware. We didn't have pixel shaders. We didn't have unified shaders. We didn't have like any of these things in a GPU, right? It was like, wasn't even called a GPU. It was called a VGA card or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's like, and people were using it in either their AGP or their PCIe slot, or PCI slot, not even PCIe, and it's like, I remember those days. I had a TNT2 and a GeForce 256 and all of that stuff going back, but it's like the software was trying so hard to keep compatibility that it ended up creating massive bottlenecks in the pipeline. So it's like, how often do we reinvent the wheel is kind of the question.
Yeah, some of it, it's just the evolution of the methodologies that we use for rendering and for this, that, and the other. And ray tracing throws a big wrinkle in all of that because nobody thought that we would be doing real-time ray tracing now. And so now that we are doing real-time ray tracing, that's opening up a whole other set of computer science that needs to be done in order to get it back to we're filling up a finite amount of pixels. How much horsepower you need to do that should be a function of number of pixels, not necessarily what's going on them. Or at least the horsepower should be dominated by number of pixels and detail, I guess.
It's kind of pulls me into like a sound analog because I think I'm going to misquote the quantity of sources. I should actually Google it really quickly. But like Dolby Atmos, how many sound sources does it have? It's I've heard this spec before. I'm going to misspeak it, and some audiophile out there is going to attack me. But like how many audio sources it can track in 3D space? It's like, I can't remember. It's like, but I think the PS5 Tempest engine could do like almost a 10 times increase in the quantity of sources that you can do in a three-dimensional audio space, right? And this is, it's kind of one of these weird things where it's like, how much do you track? How much do you track in 3D space? And, light bouncing is kind of similar. We shoot rays into a scene. What are we doing with this? We're talking about like mesh shaders, right? My question is, when you look at things like variable rate shading and mesh shaders, both of those things do a lot. So if you look at anyone, just go on YouTube and watch that mesh shader video from 3D Mark. It's like a 10 times performance increase doing that in your game in theory, but we haven't seen it really running in any games yet. So I'm curious to see if real world application's the same. But pretty much anything that is behind something now they could be really called, right? They could be called like crazy. And you can also have more meshes. So it's like, once we get to the point where the meshes aren't being generated by artists, they're being generated dynamically, and that they're being generated literally every frame in distance. But this is where it gets data crazy, right? It's like, and why it was impossible before. It was like, I'm sure people had these ideas on PS4 and Series X, but they were running on a Jaguar CPU. There was like, there's no hope, right? It's like,
if you're having trouble keeping up in the audience, until ray tracing, the way that it was is if a tree falls in the woods, it literally does not make a sound. Not only that, the tree doesn't exist. Anywhere that you're not looking does not exist. That's how we did it. We cheat, we get a lot of really amazing performance. So the problem is, imagine that you're looking in a room that's filled with marbles and lights and all kinds of stuff. If you're looking at stuff and you're doing ray tracing and the stuff that you're not looking at doesn't exist, then things get weird with the ray tracing because the light is bouncing around the room, and all of the stuff that you were previously culling and all of this magical computer science we've been doing up until ray tracing, which what we're talking about is magical stuff to do a whole other layer of culling with like simplifying meshes and reducing the complexity of models that are far away because you can't even tell anyway. Think of like a more ghetto fabulous version of this is like the texture pop in like Wolfenstein, because it's like, hey, we're not even going to bother rendering this until we can get it just right. And then it's like, oh, look, it's suddenly more high fidelity.
Yeah.
But ray tracing just takes all of that and just, because the reflections depend on stuff you can't see necessarily.
Well, this is you can summarize it pretty easily. So like one of the most common reflection methods used today is called screen space reflections. But when you see in games, literally the second you get in front of it, so if your head is blocking it, you'll see like weird lines going up and down off of your character's head, blocking the reflection, where it doesn't have that. So what we're talking about here involves, I think it's called the camera frustum, which is everything the camera sees, right, exists, and then anything outside of that space doesn't. And the problem is when you bounce a ray, it's looking for something that may not be there. So it can bounce up and down and behind an object and catch like the backside of an object, right? Or it can bounce off screen and hit something. And suddenly you need visual information that you didn't need before, right? And this is the nature of why ray tracing makes some things more difficult, right? And sometimes they just I don't know what Ratchet and Clank solution is. It looks like they just do it at a lower resolution so that it's basically doing another version of the scene with not necessarily identical assets. Sometimes they're lower quality assets to try to speed up the process of that being a secondary scene. I mean, GameCube did weird versions of this with like Wave Race, where it had a second camera that it was rendering everything to, and then it was combining them again. But there are a lot.
That's cheating.
Well, I mean, games are cheating. If you ever work in games, it's like the mystery around games dissolves immediately when you're like janking behind one of these scenes to create visual effects. It's like you're making things just warp weird, or it's like the second you look behind the camera and you look at a scene from the side, you're like, what is going on? I mean, rasterization is that in general. It's literally, as far as I'm aware, it's changing the textures and all the objects. It's modifying them to the camera's perspective. So if you could set another camera in the scene that just kept all of the textures being distorted and stuff off of the initial camera, you would see the crazy looking scene. It wouldn't even make sense, right? And that's why rasterization can happen so quickly. But I don't know, we're kind of going all over the place, but it's fun.
But all of this has to do with the
Steam Deck
from Valve.
Yes.
Game hardware, like the developer side of things. This has been a fun chat.
Yeah.
That's probably enough rambling for today, though.
It probably is.
Where can they find you? Where is the link that I'm putting in the description?
Oh my goodness. It's funny that I was going to talk about a couple other things, but
okay. I mean, we got time.
No, it's fine. I was just going to ask you what it was like balancing content between your Linux and your general audience.
Oh, that's hard. I've been neglecting the Linux content. I'm so sorry. I've been working on the whole GPU sharing thing, and there's a lot of really good content. If you're really jonesing for stuff, you can check out some of the craft computing videos that he did on one GPU. He put 3 1070s in a machine, and that was enough to run 12 1080p game servers just for giggles.
Cool.
So it doesn't quite work yet on Ampere. It's almost working on Ampere, but there's some wrinkles with Ampere. Because it works a little differently than it did with prior generation GPUs. But yeah, Linux is a lot of fun. I like Linux for things that's like things that I want to carry with me for the rest of my life. Linux is the only thing that I trust to do that. And everything else is more ephemeral. It's like, Windows, I'm going to play some games and do some stuff. It's Windows. It can go away tomorrow because somebody in Redmond decided they didn't want to do that anymore.
Yeah.
Whereas with Linux has yet to let me down in terms of like losing data or being weird or just doing something that I couldn't look at and figure out why it was doing that. And then it was like, okay, this makes sense. Or, okay, I see why they did that. I don't agree with it. I'm going to change it.
Yeah. So these are like fun projects you work on in Linux as a means to, because I mean, from a Linux side, it seems like they get most invested when you're actually doing something. You have some project or some idea that needs tackling. And then when they have the ability to use the open source nature to help, right? Or assist or have ideas that can be used or analyze code or QA. There's lots of things they could do there.
Yeah, see, the crazy thing about Linux is that Linux has absolutely taken over the entire universe everywhere, except the desktop. So when people are like, Linux, blah, 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 it's like, you know what? I'm cool. It's like, I'm a part of the whole Linux thing. It's like Dr. Evil. It's like we've completely taken over the entire world. We run all the corporations and all of the heads of state answer to us, except for Starbucks. Yeah. It's so weird. Starbucks is its own thing. They've got their own Space Force. We don't have control of Starbucks. Everybody likes Starbucks.
This is the Steam Deck debate coming back again, right? It's like, how do we target the average person, right? The average person isn't going to tear apart their console or their thing. They're not going to dig deep into software. They're not going to write their own code, right? That's not what the mass of people is going to do. So I think that this is like kind of coming back. It's just getting the artist in earlier, right? How do we make the ecosystem friendly enough to not alienate the people that are needed the most to make it usable for everyone? Because those things don't make it usable for average consumers. Something that's very clean, easy to operate, and makes sense, or that, is interesting to look at, or those kind of things are things that are more likely to draw on the average person.
Do you think, this really will close up the circle. Do you think that because of the, hyper ad spyware world that is more and more people are becoming aware of, do you think there's more of a chance that if they saw something like the open source version of the Sunbeam toaster and a site for things that they need for living, utility things that are useful, not necessarily vintage, but just like, hey, this product is this product, and it's not trying to sell you ads. It's like, I'm going to buy a really nice LG TV, but now it's got ads and all this
Mm,
unpleasantness, and it's like, what are you going to do? Buy something else? Well, there isn't anything else.
yeah.
Do you think that there will be more opportunity for those kinds of things? Because that's what Linux is. That's what ultimately you come to appreciate it. What if it's like, I'm gonna buy my forever kitchen mixer. I'm gonna buy my forever toaster. I'm gonna buy my forever keyboard.
Well, from a
There's
waste
whole subreddits
perspective,
for like forever products. So
yeah, well, I mean, like there's a lot of use in getting rid of a lot, like disposability and stuff isn't sustainable long term, right? And it's a lot of these profit models aren't. So when you're talking about Linux, it's like, what are you going to push, right? There's no one selling the next aspect of it, right? So to what is it, devalue it, right? Like forced obsolescence or something like that. And you're saying that there's a security, not a security advantage, but there isn't like the telemetry necessary and things like that to like reading in it to find something to sell you, right? Like I think that I'm hoping that obviously products go towards that, but it's like our whole hype cycle's built the opposite way, right? It's like we're looking for the next hardware, right? We're talking about the next thing to throw away all our handhelds. That's what we're talking about right now, right?
there was a Reddit thread that was I can't remember. It was a refrigerator, and Lowe's had a refrigerator on sale, and it was like way below retail, and it was because it had such bad reviews that nobody wanted to buy it, and it was like, is a TV real, or is a refrigerator really that badly engineered? And there was a Reddit thread, and somebody said, oh, here's the problem. This part, if you just replace this with this other thing, it'll cost you about $8. Here's where you can order it from. It'll prevent something from happening with the compressor, which will wear it out prematurely. And while you're at it, you could go ahead and make this change, and then it'll probably live forever.
Yeah.
And somebody posted, and it was like, oh my gosh, this has got to be planned obsolescence. And it turned into this big thread. And then there was somebody else that posted and was like, I don't think this is planned obsolescence. I think this is just, the drive for making everything cheaper. And they just messed up. They made it a little too cheap. And I don't know if you should go modifying your fridge and blah, blah, blah. And then the person replied to it was like, no, I'm the engineer that worked on this. I was literally in the meeting where the marketing people overrode my decision. And it was like, this is engineered to last 5 years. And it's like a fridge should be like a 20 or 30-year thing. And it's like, this is almost scandalous. Now, could have just been somebody trolling or something really awful.
It's
But
possible, yeah.
that seems like the world that we're in these days.
Yeah, and
So
we have all these people talking about, save the universe and all this, and at the same time, there's this consumer ecosystem that's just cycling over and over again. And it's like part of it we're caught up in, and, everyone has their blind spots. It's like the tech aspect of that I do follow like that, whereas I would be happy to have a refrigerator forever. It's like, I'm not going to want a refrigerator that, like, tells me how I look today or something in 10 years. I hope I don't, right? Or like,
it's going to be dangerously insecure. It'll be, I guarantee you, if you bought that fridge, it's going to be mining Bitcoin for somebody.
Probably. You're going to pick up a yogurt and they'd be like, should you eat that? And I'm like, what is wrong with you, fridge? I don't know what your problem is. But it's like,
look at Windows 11. Microsoft is like, you need this level of encryption and trusted platform. Otherwise, you're not going to be eligible for Windows 11. And it's like, is your computer going to get email and make documents worse as a result of not being able to have the fancy Hollywood encryption? No. Well, why do you have to have that?
They're obviously worried about something, maybe something we don't even know about, right? Like there could be some side channel attack that we're not aware of, some way listening to the electronic frequency of your power supply in a way that, it's like...
The only thing that I can think of is that they could roll in some kind of malware protection into that, but that means that they're going to a walled garden again. That means they're going to like Apple's ecosystem where everything is like super locked down. I don't think PC hardware can even deliver that level of a solution, just because there are so many side channel attacks. It's just not built to do that. And TPM2, it might work for 6 months, but 6 months after TPM2, somebody's gonna just destroy it, and then the whole reason for requiring it will be moot.
This is kind of funny because this makes me think of HDCP right away.
Yeah.
Where it's like when HDCP came out, they were trying to push it in everything. And even you'd have devices that were suddenly not compatible and they wouldn't handshake. And then you would just get black screens and it would drive you crazy. You'd be like, oh, I can't display anything.
I
and
have
it's
to
like,
deal with that on the KVMs. Me.
Yeah.
Joe Rando. And it's
Yeah.
just like, this is so stupid. And the only thing it has ever done is inconvenience paying customers.
Well, I mean, I'm sure initially it slowed down the wave of Blu-ray rips, but which was it's likely its biggest intention at the beginning, right? But that was like it's exactly what you're saying, right? It's like it's a countermeasure that, I mean, obviously it's HTCP is laughable now for, I have EDID spoofing devices just because my TV runs it can do 1440p 120, but Sony didn't make it available. So you do an
Those are illegal here in the States.
EDID spoofers?
Yeah.
Really?
You can buy them anyway, but they're not legal.
Oh, I didn't know that. I live in Canada, so hopefully it's okay here. It's just literally to run a resolution that I wouldn't have been able to run.
Yeah,
just
it's like because it's like what again? It's like I need the Sunbeam toaster. It's just a display device. Why does it need this?
yeah,
Sorry.
yeah. Well, I mean, anyways, if we were to summarize kind of the things that we went over, right? It's like Steam Deck. Do we think it's going to improve Linux adoption? Is that like how much do you think it's going to move that needle? A little bit, a lot?
Indirectly, it might a little bit.
Yeah.
But Linux is already literally everywhere except the desktop. So in that regard, not going to make a difference.
Well, maybe Gabe
Steam
can
Deck,
pull it off.
Will Steam Deck drive Linux adoption on the desktop? No.
And did I get a percentage from you for what percentage of the hardware you can take advantage of if we had Vulkan and Linux ports of games? If maybe that's just something that will be more targeted going forward.
I think if you're targeting the exact specific hardware, you could probably get a 1.8x performance increase. But because of the Proton layer and blah, 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 your AAA titles are probably going to struggle to hit 30 FPS at native resolution. But that will improve more than everybody thinks in the 6 months following. So there's pre-orders already for like a year. So the people at the tail end of the pre-order are going to have a way better experience than the people at the beginning of the pre-order. But I don't think that 30 FPS for AAA titles and 60 FPS for not AAA titles is unrealistic. I think that'll work really well.
And it depends on the game, right? It's like, I think Devil May Cry 5, if you're playing that, you'll probably be able to hit 60 at 720p on this. Yeah. If you're playing Red Dead Redemption 2, you're probably going to be at 30, right? And this is like something I was talking about a bit with Moore's Law is Dead, but my understanding is that roughly you lose about 40% of your hardware capabilities to your API overhead. And I'm expecting Proton to take another 5 to 10, right? For these AAA games. So, and then I'm hoping when we see games that target both Linux and Vulkan primarily as a means to target the device directly, we can see you getting 80 to 90% of your performance of your device. And then you would see some of those games suddenly running to 50, 60 frames per second, being the exact same game. But not...
I think you're probably right, but it's probably going to take 6 months to a year after it's out, and the momentum of having sold more than 5 million units.
Well, maybe we should poke some developers right now. We should say, hey, you developer, prove us. Show us. I want to see. Tell me where we're wrong. Yeah. Hey, Red Dead Redemption 2 developers, let's see. Can you get this to go at 60 frames per second at its native resolution? I'm curious. They target Vulkan natively, so they just have to port to Linux. I don't know if it's on Linux, but... I'm curious. They have Vulkan as an API in Red Dead too. It's a good place to start. Let's see what we can do there, right? Rockstar, you hearing this? But anyways, I think that those are kind of the big questions. And I was going to ask you are there any real specific complications running Proton that are known? Like maybe there's just something weird in the rendering pipeline where in a subset of games that use a specific effect, you get like it rendering on the wrong layer or behind things or in front of things or something like that.
I don't know that we've seen enough to really know. The thing that I always use to kind of track that is the BioShock Infinite games. Because, whenever like the newest distro comes out or the newest thing comes out, I'll always quickly load up BioShock Infinite. And it's got, you can tell that there's a little bit of rust. There's a few rotten boards here and there, but it's still functional. It's surprisingly functional. But there's just in the last 6 months, the things like some of the menu settings are mysteriously black for no reason. Sometimes some of the special effects are weird. If you run through the benchmark I've run through the benchmark so many times that I know what the benchmark does, and it'll still play fine, and it'll still look fine, and things will still happen in the benchmark, but there will be little subtle visual differences.
Hmm.
Sometimes, like some of the special effects, will be like a little black halo for a second when something loads, or like a texture will be a little different than it was on a previous run because maybe they changed how the coordinate system, like maybe 0, 0 used to be top left and now it's like bottom left or something.
Hmm.
I don't know, but and that's one of the really early kind of that's not really maybe the best example
I can imagine
for
some things like post processing effects rendering
yeah,
differently at different resolutions, and things like that, like your whatever your depth of field being way off. It's just like everything's
yeah,
blurry close to the screen or something like that theoretically happening.
yeah, sometimes. So I don't know, but that's something to keep an eye on is those kind of things, especially with those older games. And but Proton gets better and better and better. And also, don't forget you've got facilities in Steam to pick like this version was better, which
Mm.
kind of I was sort of hinting at with the whole like the 2016 version. Steam realizes that too, and they're building that in so that they can say, all right, this game works best with this version of Proton. Let's just roll it out with this version of Proton.
I,
So they're kind of covering all the different contingencies.
well, I wonder, because this is kind of why, because people will say, why doesn't Xbox just give us backwards compatibility? And there's two reasons for that, right? There's the reason that they can't guarantee they could just probably activate it across all games, but they can't curate it. They can't. First of all, licensing is going to be a nightmare. So they're going to be like companies that are like, hey, we wanted to charge. We were just doing a remaster of this, and you just distributed it for free, basically, right? And then the other aspect of it would be that they can't possibly QA it. I remember they did it with the Xbox 360, and I think I played Silent Hill 2 Restless Dreams on 360. And when you get to the elevator at the end, it was doing really wonky things. And I think I played the Panzer Dragoon Orta on Xbox 360 with its backwards compatibility. And one level, the polygons were just like ripping out of all of the meshes and going all over the places. And the screen was like flashing bright white when like a polygon would go in front of the camera really quickly and things like that. And it's like, they did not QA this correctly. They didn't test this to make sure that every possible edge case was, and which is why they do a more curated approach with releasing, they test these run of games and then they can check to see. And I mean, AI testing has come a long way too,
Yeah.
on top of that, so you don't need to have exactly the manpowers. There's one thing that just triggered me I wanted to say, but all of these kind of things affect game development. They affect, and this is my curiosity with this Proton layer, how reliable is this going to be, right? For these things, what kind of weird quirks can we expect to see? How common are they? What percentage of games run okay? I mean, I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but I know, for instance, like if Valve just took, I don't know, 10 times more time than they did with every other developer just to make sure that Unreal 4 ran fine, they would cover 40 to 60% of all games just by
Probably
making
doing
sure.
that.
Yeah, they most likely are. But it's kind of funny because there's something that I've heard talked about with, do you remember when Nvidia was is it their grid for their streaming?
Mhm.
And I remember PC gamers were getting all upset when games were getting delisted from it
Yeah.
because they didn't understand. And I'm like, I feel like I understand exactly why this is happening. And every PC site that I heard was getting it completely wrong. And the thing is that they don't understand that a lot of game developers survive on licensing deals, and you'll get like Google or Microsoft or one of these companies with the stream thing coming to you and offering you a ton of money for exclusive streaming rights on that game. So, and for small studios, that's often how they survive. So to be suddenly made available on a service for free cuts in that ability for small studios to survive on that front. And that's the thing that a lot of people weren't catching with that. They were like, why is this company being greedy? It's all about money. It's like, well, some of them it might come off this way. Some of them times there's agreements in place, right? And some of the times they might need that in the future to survive.
Yeah, like the remaster version. Although I think Rockstar is taking out a lot of mods and changing things retroactively. It's a really fine line that you have to walk
Yeah. Game
in order
development.
to be able to do that. Game
Yeah.
development is not fun, and no matter how you cut the cheese, it's not fun.
I mean, all of this game development is like this is all a mad show, and everyone only operates with this small portion of the picture of everything that they need to solve it, and you have to rely on all sorts of other people and like just making decisions. So I don't know. It's like the Steam Deck's exciting. I'm excited for it. I'm lucky I got a pre-order in. So I'm curious to see it when it comes out. I'm sure I'll test it out. But
I got a pre-order in as well. So we'll
I was in the first minute. Even and it went through a crash. Like it didn't go through. I did it like 15 times. I was pushing it, and then it crashed. And then I got an email with a receipt, and I was like, "Okay, I think I'm okay. I think I'm okay." I got the receipt email, so it's like it was one of those kind of funny things. But yeah. So I mean, the only other things I really wanted to talk to you about is what it was like working on promotional gifts together. I think it was fun doing those with you, and it seemed like it was just one of these things like, hey, what would be really silly? What would be fun to do this? And I think you found your identity in that kind of with your YouTube channel, where it's like just being a bit sillier and wonkier and about these kind of things. And
yeah, no, definitely. And also, I was a little bit prescient too, because I was like, AMD was kind of the underdog, and it's like, oh, they're onto something. And then they just have been on this relentless march of insanity, and it's been awesome to watch them do that.
well, the release cadence has been relentless, right?
Yeah.
And like I was saying before, it was like the key, which is funny, the biggest bottleneck with Ryzen 1 that pulled all of this together is Infinity Fabric, as far as I'm concerned. That innovation has been what allows them to both innovate and to pivot when something doesn't work. And so if they have some kind of hardware failure or something, they can substitute something else in some occasions, right? Or if they have a licensing agreement with Global Foundries that's causing an issue in some way or another, they can give them the IO die, or they can, right? There's several things they've been able to pivot on with both hardware. It's like the HBM memory in Vega was connected via Infinity Fabric, right? Yeah. It's like these kind of things that these hardware things, and it's like, for me, it's kind of funny because they're doing these like gifs of Lisa Su, right? It's like, the company really did turn around after she came into play. And part of that was like listening to a couple of talks with Jim Keller. There's definitely some groundwork that he laid with the teams that he set out. And then, but just the cadence is relentless. And I'm worried something's going to sideline all of that. I'm just afraid of 10 more years of quad cores is what I'm afraid of in the tech space. Mind you, we were talking about fridges that would last forever, so maybe we do need the same quad core in our computer for the next, not quad core, but like 16 core in our computer for the next 10 years. Maybe we'll be okay with that. But yeah, so anyways, it was real fun working on those collaborations with you. So, people online can check them out.
Your work was brilliant, and so definitely thanks very much. And yeah, everybody should check those out.
Yeah,
I'm sure that everybody had seen those on my side for the Twitter account, because it was like 2,000 likes and 1 million retweets or whatever. Something crazy.
Man, I just had a Metroid one go absolutely nuts on me. I don't even know what to do with it, but it made me have a bunch of game ideas. But I thought that I would end this asking you, from my perspective, maybe you could throw a couple questions my way afterwards, but what's the favorite piece of hardware you played with?
I don't know. I just built a Pi DP11. It's a PDP 1170. It's basically a glorified Raspberry Pi hat, but it's a mini computer from the 1970s. But it's emulating a mini computer from the 1970s. But it really is there with 4 Trans 77 and the whole 9 yards. And so it was one of the last big computers that could run multi-user Unix, because 1970s. And it was supported, and they were still selling them in the 90s. But it was one of the last, like, quote unquote real computers that you could actually program through the switches in the front. So like how you picked what it's going to boot up is you would flip the switches to the address, which was on the mass storage bus.
It's like literally analog programming.
Yeah, like you flip the switches and you load it into a register, and you flip the switches and you load it into a register, but you flip the switches for the address where you want it to boot from, and then you flip the switch and it boots. And so the software image actually comes with some different historical operating systems that you can play with. And so there's a table of addresses, and you can load you can halt execution and then load some stuff into the register table, and then be like, jump to this address. and then whatever it was doing, it immediately stops, jumps to that address, and then you're in, you've booted into whatever that old operating system is. So it's a lot of fun because you got your Unix roots, but there's blinking lights all over the front of it. It's pretty awesome.
It's kind of funny because it's like, I feel like this conversation, it's like, I've kind of almost always wanted to see you on, what is it? Because you restrain yourself a lot for your level 1 tech in terms of what you know and what depths you go into, I find.
Oh no, there's a huge number. I know what I don't know, and I sort of am connected to people that know a lot of things, and I get to live vicariously with what they do.
Totally.
And so it's very exciting.
Well, they're engineers and there are people, but you're like, you're on the cusp of the ones that are probably the personable enough to communicate it, right? Versus people who just don't want to. Even if they were, they might not have the chance to bother, right? And it's like, as far as like tech YouTubers and stuff go, it's like, it feels like you're kind of more deep in that, especially in Linux, right? Like in that ecosystem than the vast majority of them, while still having a channel that's successful.
For the ride.
Yeah.
I mean, it's when I was in high school, I built a there was another student and I, we were still really good friends. We built a Linux machine because the high school that we were at had an internet connection, but not all the computers could get on the internet. And it was like, we would really, the internet is transformational. We should have all the computers have the internet.
Yeah.
And it was really poor, because we grew up in a really like dirt poor area.
Yeah.
And it was like, we can't, it would cost $10,000 of network gear in order to be able to provide internet for everything. And so he and I sat down and like, we were enterprising and resourceful and not troublemakers exactly, but
yeah.
And so we built a thing to do what was called IP masquerading at the time. And that was disruptive. It was like a lot of people were like really like super upset and because it was like, oh, we can't, whatever. Because it's like, look, there was a problem. We solved it. We did it with Linux. It was like a very early version of Linux. And Linux has the potential to be that disruptive. And that's what Linux has done over and over again. It's like, I need a cheap, easy database. Linux. Oh, I need a cheap, easy web server. It's going to be a Linux-based,
Yeah.
It's going to end up, so Linux is taking over literally everything. There was an ISP in our town, and we knew the guy that ran it, and you would get all this. There was all this proprietary technology for running your ISP and your dial-up modems and blah blah blah. But then he was like, "What if we use Linux for that?" And so they ended up making so much money because they weren't buying any proprietary stuff. They're using Linux. That they ended up buying the ISP that had helped them start by leasing them a line, because initially running an ISP was like a drug dealer. It was like your first hit's free, but then you got to buy all this proprietary stuff and you got to buy your upstream provider, and everybody's making money up the chain. Then all of a sudden you got this enterprising group in rural Eastern Kentucky that's like, what if we just didn't buy this stuff and we just built our own and did our own software? And then all of a sudden they were making money hand over fist. And this was really early on before Linux was kind of a thing.
This is the early mid-90s probably, so you'd be...
Yeah.
That would have been a lot of money at the time.
Yes. And so they ended up buying the ISP that they seeded from. They just ended up buying everything.
This is why you guys are so obsessed about service providers on Level1Tech. You have like these deep inner roots from service providers. That's why you're always talking about that. It's like most of my hate for Comcast comes from you guys. So it's like, I don't even live in the States. I got no service from them, so it doesn't make a difference to me.
Comcast got a lot of money to run. And they
fiber everywhere, and they didn't. Oh, I know. I know. You've told that story many times.
So frustrating.
So, is there anything you want to ask me?
No, I think we've pretty well covered everything. I mean, it's what do you enjoy most about where you see game development going, or like, what's something that you look forward to being able to do with the trajectory that we're on for game development that maybe right now is just on the cusp of being in reach?
Well, I think that like small team game design is very interesting to me. And I think that comes from my roots, because it's like when I grew up playing like Super Nintendo or PS1 games, you had like, or NES even before that, but most of my favorite ones are Super Nintendo or PS1 or N64 or whatnot, the teams were still relatively small. And it's easier to keep a unified vision. Like being an art director or whatnot on a game is difficult. And the larger the team is, the harder it is to keep that vision intact. So what I'm hoping new tools do is allow smaller games to look like bigger ones for that reason of having a more cohesive type vision, right? It's like, I don't know, I like Final Fantasy VI, which is like ancient, is one of my favorite games, but it has this like really cohesive vision. And I feel like games kind of lose that. Every once in a while you get one game that comes out that kind of gives you that feeling that old games give. And it's like, part of it's like, am I just getting old? Or are they making these different than I used to, right? Or, you know, it's like, or maybe both.
Somebody came in, just like somebody substituted parts on that fridge that was like worth $15. Somebody came in and were like, how can we let this thing down with lots and lots of microtransactions? And it's just like, no.
Well, you know, you go to conferences or whatnot. It's like big games. They need more than one studio. Even they'll be subletting to other studios to help with these games, right? It's like, and they're all very talented people, but it's just so much harder to keep. If you have like any uniqueness to your art vision at all, other than just representing reality, then you lose a bit of that with each extra person that comes on a project. I don't know if that's 100% true, but it's how I feel about how games have gone.
In software development, we call that a camel is a horse built by committee.
But I don't even know if it's built by committee, because it can have like a really unified direction. And you still see games succeed on this despite it. Like I'd say God of War, the most recent one, succeeded on that despite this. And a bunch of other games have had really unique artistic visions despite this with big teams. But I'd say it's less common. And when you saw it, even though it was like wonkier, it's like I went back recently and I played through a huge run of PS1 and Super Nintendo games. And the fun thing about PS1 games is that they're terrible in ways that blindside you, but it's more interesting in a way, because people hadn't figured out standard camera distances around characters or controls for these things. And you're just playing, and it'll be the wonkiest thing that you encounter, but it's refreshing in a way where it's like, now it's like they know exactly how far to set the camera away from a character. They know exactly, you know what I mean? It's like all of these little, they're innovations, I'll say, but it's like there's something fresh about playing Bushido Blade and then putting in like Jumping Flash or like whatever else, like some other game, and it's like, what the heck's going on here, right? And it's like you go over to your friend's house and play Goldeneye, you're like, well, this is even stranger, you know? It's like all of this stuff is hitting you from side to side. So I hope that we see some of that. It's like when you see what they're doing with Unreal 5, it looks like, especially with like having Quixel mega scans and stuff, you can just kind of make an environment on the fly. It's like, I'm curious when the tech gets easier, whether you're going to see some small visions that have really interesting like artistic direction, or like almost like little beautiful simple games in a way. I don't know.
SNKRX, that's been our crack here at the office for a while, and it's so simple, and it's like it's a Snake and roguelike combined.
SNKRX, I have to look this up.
Yeah, you'll have to play tomorrow. You'll message me and be like, I hate you. You will have wasted so much time playing SNKRX. But yeah, it's exactly what you're talking about.
No, my days are full for the next like 2 weeks, so there's no chance.
Someone is banging on the office door, so let me go see what that is. Hang on.
No worries.
All right, where were we? Sorry.
That's all right. I think we were just kind of chatting a bit about. I asked you what your favorite hardware was. You asked me what I was hoping for from games. And yeah, I don't know. I was trying to think of what we could do to wrap this up.
I think. Oh, got any ideas?
No, I mean, it's been awesome talking to you. I always love, like, I feel like I ranted on you the first time we chatted. It's kind of funny because it's like,
no, rants are good because it's usually like, this is the specific. See, again, a large part of the experience is around like what the suffering is. And it's like, we build our own cages. Like, we can build a better software environment. We can build a thing where game developers, where artists can have their craft and tell a story and do something interesting. And you're going to suffer a little bit for your art, but you don't suffer at the hands of someone that has created a terrible environment for you to have to deal with, because the art ends up getting mutated and lost a little bit the more of that you have to deal with as an artist.
Yeah, the more hands and the more. Well, it's kind of I'm split on that, right? Because it's like I think there's a funny. I remember finding like an article ages ago that was talking about Silicon Knights, Factor 5, and um, Rare, and how they all basically thought that they were going to make way better games when they left Nintendo. And then they all left Nintendo, and their games were arguably all worse once they left Nintendo. And
See also Daikatana. See also.
yeah, well, there's a lot of examples like that, and it's like I think the same thing's kind of true when you see like art in old games. It's like sometimes like games have lost their otherworldliness to some extent, right? Where it's like you play NES Mega Man 2, it feels like you're off in space in some other deep galactic civilization with some of the colors they mash together and all of that. And you play Mega Man 11, and it just looks like Earth with robots. And it's like, you know, that kind of thing happens across lots of things. There's really interesting things that happen from limitations. I mean, I work in everything. I do concept art, I do pixel art, I do 3D as well. And like there's such a big difference between like working in the crazy limitations of like a canvas of 100 by 100 pixels versus, you know, making a mesh, throwing UVs on it, things like this, right? Or like scanning an asset or whatever it is particularly that you do. It's like they're all different methods. And then it's, you know, games can look like anything. So it's just a matter of picking what best suits the idea, right? That's where art direction comes into things. So I'm curious what will open up for us in the future. I'm hoping, and this is some gamers will hate this, some gamers will love this, but I'm hoping we'll see an art renaissance like we saw when they invented cameras, where artists were suddenly freed from having to capture reality because that was their job. They were court painters or whatnot, and they would have to paint whoever rich people paid to paint them. And then all of a sudden they invented cameras, and it's like, oh, that job's taken up now. So now we can paint whatever the heck we want. So they got looser with their strokes. They were freed from reality for the first time, and I think we're going to see a resurgence of that. We're going to hit the Unreal, 6, whatever window it is that looks almost exactly like reality, and then maybe people will start deviating from there. And if every game could look real and the real isn't interesting, then we'll see what happens afterwards. But it'll be more utility at that point. Then everyone won't have to go into a store and try clothes on anymore. They can just like they have themselves scanned and they can just drag clothes on their model on their phone. And then, it's like there's this alternate reality where, maybe the power isn't in your pocket. Maybe it's in a server somewhere, right? But maybe it's some quantum computer that can render everything simultaneously rather than doing separate instances per each device. But
it is going to be interesting. There's going to be, in that vein, I think there's going to be a lot of bridge over between Hollywood and motion capture and like the Andy Serkis type stuff, and then assets that are captured and usable for that kind of thing, and also the deep fake AI, but in a good way, and all that kind of stuff. I mean, did you see the thing where like the rando with not saying they're not talented, really talented guy, I'm sure, but the rando with deep fakes in the
Star Wars?
Yeah, and it's like, oh, that was better than what we normally do because the technology is moving so fast now.
Well, yeah, and it's like, you look at like the lip on Justice League or whatever, it's like sometimes doing a CG solution and mapping it isn't going to capture the nuances of it, right? And it's like the amount of time individual humans have going frame by frame and modifying something and then getting tired or getting, like there's so many different things that can happen in a person's mind space while they're doing something like that. So having an AI take care of those kind of things is definitely the future in a lot of regards. But I don't know, like, I think that all of this stuff, like this is obviously new tech. Steam Deck's kind of weird for me in that its feature parity is matched to, PS5 and Series X in terms of like the hardware features are all there. I mean, not the Tempest engine and not some of the ASICs that they have in both of those other consoles, but the base, mesh shading, variable rate shading, sampler feedback, all that stuff should be accessible to developers on there, although some of those are part of the DirectX 12 Ultimate API, so they would have to make their own version of it that utilizes the same hardware. So it's like this is kind of an interesting, hopefully we see a lot more support for these kind of features than we have historically, and then GCN could push. I always thought it was kind of funny because you would hear these people talking like online that oh, well, they're going to do these GCN optimizations that will make them run better in PC games. And it's like, a little bit,
Maybe
but
a little.
like they were feature robbed in a lot of ways. You didn't really see ever what all of these cards are capable of. And even Nvidia, they had previous generation cards with features that weren't used, and then they end up taking out the hardware in the future, right? It's like these things can happen, and it's like I'm always interested in seeing like from part of me that's obsessed with the tech itself is always like, what can this do at its absolute maximum, right? When every part of it is utilized, even if it requires a paradigm shift. And this is where I'm blasphemous. I build crazy PCs, but I like console games, but because the art direction is usually crazy on console games, because someone pushing like that last little corner out of a piece of hardware is fascinating to me. Seeing someone do something on like a Game Boy that shouldn't have been possible. It's like, what? Like, how did you do that? Right. Or like watching the retrospective on Crash Bandicoot and how they did that. And they were like, literally, they made a new software because they animated every vertex, and rather than, because, and then they had a complete like passing every section of the level out of RAM and back in as they needed it. Right. It's like, and they had to design the levels expecting to delete these things as you move forward. Right. It's like, all of these weird tricks and stuff that you do to get the most out of that, where it's like PCs typically brute force things and then you lose 40% of your power. And in part of it, like all of the feature and hardware loss is somewhat uninteresting to me. Having that computer in your house is very interesting, and benchmarking it and seeing what it can do. I love that kind of stuff. But it's like the performance you lose on a PC to not really seeing what it, like if they took a 3090 or a 6900 XT and they threw it in a console, what they could do with that would be insane, right? Like, it would be absolutely insane, but we won't see it. We're going to see what it looks like when you lose 30 to 40% of the hardware to API overhead. And, and features being unutilized because people are also using 750s. It's like you end up with this kind of wonky space, and it's like, I don't know. I'm optimistic for all of it. And it's, for me, it's like the channel that I'm trying to start. So obviously I've been watching a lot of channels for a long time, and I was like, I would just want to have a channel that's focused on art, games, and tech, and how all three of those things link together. And that's why I called it Pixels Refreshed, just because all three of them, in one way, is if you're updating pixel art, you're refreshing the pixels with a new look. Another way, pixels are refreshed on a screen, right? And that's part of what we see. And everyone draws and makes these things with pixels that are constantly refreshing. So I thought, whatever, I'll give this a try, see how it goes.
Good. Yeah,
but
I mean, technology drives all aspects of our lives these days, and having more artists doing really interesting craft with technology, and there's a lot of it's really, you've got a lot of opportunity to do interesting stuff.
Yeah, and also just talking to people, because I'm always like, I'm fascinated by all of these kind of conversations, and I would typically have them at like GDC or Gamescom or whatnot. You'd be showcasing a game, and then someone comes up and asks you how you do something, right? It's like, how did you do this weird rendering effect? We wanted to do that in our game, right? It's like, what restrictions do you put in place? It's like, oh, what are you using for your lighting, right? It's like all of these kind of questions. Well, how did you make this level work? And it's like, oh, well, I did this, and this, right? It's like, like the elevator level I did in Star Renegades was just like a nightmare of math. It was more math than art, because it's like tons of parallax layers calculated at specific distances to make the illusion of depth. But there's like no real depth whatsoever in that scene. I mean,
that's how that was done.
Yeah, I know. So it's like, I mean, games are such nonsense behind the scenes. They're like, and everyone's just, flying by the seat of their pants, trying to hoping that there's something beautiful at the end of it.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
go for it.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No. I was just going to say that it's like, that's why, like, I'm just always, I mean, there's so many war stories of developing software. There's so many weird scenarios, or like, I'm sure you could have a channel where you just talk about the funniest bugs developers faced.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like, that could be an entire channel. What's your funniest bug? And then you just hear them explain whatever that bug was for a half an hour, and you could just laugh about it.
You open the door and you fall through the floor.
Oh yeah. Well, that's a common bug. You didn't set your collision mesh as well. It's like
Yeah.
I had that happen in Uncharted too. Even in the most polished game, I was like jumping along the side rocks and this one mountain thing, and for some reason it just pushed me through the wall of the mountain, and then I was like, okay, I'm seeing things. I definitely same thing happened in Shadow of the Colossus, which is the very like the PS2 one. I got stuck inside a Colossus. And I was like, there was no way to get out of it. I was like trapped in there. I'm like, oh man, this is messed up. But it's like, I don't know. I feel like the tech space is weird because it's like you have all of these channels that are doing mostly the same thing, right? Frame rate, GPU review out, and it's like there's all of these interesting conversations that I hear with tons of people, and some of them are so much beyond me. It's amazing. Like I'm not amazing at any of these things. I just feel like I know enough about enough of the subject matters that I can at least be in the conversation, right? And it's like, and some of them, the one I know probably the more about is art. But it's kind of like I'm looking to explore some of these unexplored spaces, and it's just talking to people, right? It's like I always found, the few conversations I'd hear with you doing the same thing really fascinating, or when,
Well, it's a different perspective, and it's also real world experience perspective. And bringing your real world experience to anything that you want to share is always going to have a different. It's always going to put a different spin on it from anybody else. So it always, like, for me, I like to live vicariously through the experience of others because I can add their experience to my own as long as I can correctly internalize it. Sometimes it's like, I'm learning something from what they've written or what they've said or from, a shared experience, but, their takeaway was different than my takeaway, but that's usually because of an incomplete understanding on my part. And so the more that you can share, the more different perspective, the more that you can help fill in the gaps for somebody that's looking for that kind of information. So it's always really nice.
Yeah, and you just get also kind of just weird things, right? So anyways, I mean, I don't want to take up too much of your time. We've been going for over 2 hours now, so
yeah, we'll have to edit this down just a bit.
Yeah, are you going to edit it?
No, someone else is going to have to edit it.
Someone else. Okay. No, that's perfectly fine. I appreciate that. But anyways, I mean, we can wrap this up now if you want.
Yeah. I mean, it's like I'm trying to think what would be a good outro or a good exit.
Yeah.
I think. I can do the level 1 outro, which is it's like. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this level 1 ramble with me and Brian. Be sure to check out his new channel and all the fun stuff that he's been working on. And there's probably a longer unedited version of this or less edited version of this.
Yeah,
it's available on his channel, so you can check that out.
Well, I don't even know. I might just wait for the version from you. Just plug that in. Just
2023 is like, okay, there we go.
Yeah. But maybe I'll put the unedited version live, or I'll do a quick edit of them myself. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. Thanks for taking the time to talk. I really appreciate your insights.
With me, because for what you do, you are a really incredibly talented artist, and having the technical perspective also just saves me a lot of time from having to try to figure out how it relates to the stuff that I'm already interested in. So it works out a lot.
Yeah.
There's definitely some self-interest in being able to talk to you and understand your perspective on industry stuff, because you get what's happening with the shader, you get what's happening with the render pipeline, and you get what's happening with the hardware people are going for, because really a lot of this stuff is educated guesses they made 5 years ago. It's just now making it into hardware, because that's the life cycle that we're dealing with.
Well, I have a bare minimum understanding. Like I see some profiling. I see, the typical, hey, what's this? Why is this taking up so much time in the render pipeline, right? This stuff that is, it's part of all of this, but it's not like I want to find out even more, right? I'm looking to have part of the reason I want to do this is just talk to developers who've gone even more in depth, right? Like the ones that have scraped that little bit of processing out of the corner, right? Or found some kind of workaround that saves a bunch of time. But thank you so much for your time, Wendell. It's always
thank you.
It's always great to do this. If you ever want to do any pixel art collabs in the future, you just feel free to reach out. And
there's some new Threadrippers coming out.
There might be.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Anyways, so yeah, catch this on Pixels Refreshed and on